The story begins in the desolate realm of the dead, a place known as Necropia. This forsaken domain, devoid of any trace of life, stretched endlessly with barren lands. Yet, amid this bleak landscape, a single imposing castle stood tall, defying the gloom. It was the only castle in all of Necropia, a fortress filled with unimaginable wonders. Inside, endless golden pillars gleamed, adorned with exquisite ornaments and murals, their beauty a stark contrast to the desolation outside. The grand marble hall sprawled beneath, while intricately crafted sculptures lined its walls, each a masterpiece of glorious detail. But among all these marvels, one stood supreme, the symbol of ultimate authority, the master of the realm itself. At the heart of Necropia, the absolute ruler reigned, the Death King Karnak. King Karnak, who had transcended all and mastered the very essence of death, came to a profound realization after a century: humans were never meant to wield such power. In his mortal days, Karnak had been the illegitimate child of a disgraced noble family. He lost his mother at a young age and, in the face of relentless pressure and scorn from other nobles, grew isolated, learning to trust only himself. This isolation fueled an insatiable hunger for power. In time, Karnak discovered a forbidden codex on necromancy, which led him down a dark path, far from his humanity. Consumed by his newfound abilities, Karnak unleashed death upon the world, driving both its people and the kingdom itself to their end. The fourth martial king and the three grand mages had fiercely resisted Karnak, but in the end, even they succumbed, becoming his subjugated followers. The world's guardians also rose to challenge him, but when Karnak finally enslaved the last of them, the Dragon Emperor Greatoria, his victory was complete. In an act of ultimate defiance against the natural order, Karnak transmuted his own flesh into the ultimate ascendant being known as Astra Schnapf. With this transformation, the most powerful undead entity and the strongest Death King to ever exist was born. Reflecting on these events, Karnak had once believed that everything was now his, that he could finally revel in his absolute power. But 70 years had passed since that triumph, and instead of fulfillment, Karnak found himself trapped in a hollow existence. Despite his unrivaled might, he could do nothing. Reduced to a body made of mere bones, he was incapable of experiencing any joy or satisfaction in the world he had conquered. In that moment, Karnak pondered how much longer this pointless existence could continue. His thoughts drifted back to the time when he had still been human, when he could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin and the gentle caress of the breeze. He remembered the comforting touch of another person, the warmth of human connection. Alongside those memories, however, came the recollection of terrible pain, a searing agony that pierced his flesh. Yet even that pain, Karnak realized, was preferable to the dry, hollow life he now endured. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Karnak's gaze shifted toward a mysterious monument in the distance. A glimmer of hope flickered within him. He reminded himself that his long-devised plan might still succeed. If it did, Karnak believed he could once again experience the sensations of life, the warmth, the wind, and even the pain, that had once defined his existence. At that moment, one of King Karnak's subordinates, Baros, the head commander of the Legion of Death, approached and greeted him. With reverence, Baros addressed Karnak as Lord of all the dead, ruler of life and death, and conqueror of the lands. Karnak then informed Baros that all preparations were complete. Baros was taken aback, surprised to hear the news. Sensing his commander's reaction, Karnak added, I have a good feeling about it this time. Hearing this, Baros couldn't contain his excitement. The long-awaited plan they had been working on was finally about to come to fruition, and the prospect of what was to come filled him with eager anticipation. At that moment, Karnak reflected on his long quest to regain the pleasures of the flesh, a journey he had shared with Baros. They had experimented with countless methods, turning Karnak into a vampire, attempting to possess a human body, but nothing had worked. He realized that pleasure arises from fulfilling what one lacks, and for beings like them, ascended beyond mortality, no method could satisfy their needs. However, Karnak believed that because they were the ultimate ascendants, there was still a way to reclaim their lost sensations. If they could no longer experience human pleasures because they were no longer human, Karnak resolved to change that by turning back time, returning to the days when he had been mortal. With this realization, Karnak turned to Baros and said, we will likely go back to the moment when I first gained the mana of darkness. Baros, hearing this, could barely contain his anticipation, knowing that this was the key to their plan and their chance to regain what they had long sought. Upon hearing this, Baros asked Karnak if their plan meant they would disappear from existence if they failed. Karnak raised an eyebrow and inquired why Baros was asking such a question. He added, "Do you still have regrets in life?" Baros quickly replied, insisting that he had no regrets. "This is all or nothing," he declared, determination in his voice. Satisfied, Karnak nodded, stating that it was time for them to return to the days when they were still human. With a shared sense of purpose, they activated the monument spell, and in an instant, a brilliant light enveloped them, illuminating the dark expanse of Necropia. Moments later, Karnak lay unconscious on the floor when he suddenly heard a voice calling out to him, urging him to wake up and referring to him as Master. As he opened his eyes, he saw a human face and asked, "Is that you, Baros?" Baros confirmed it was indeed him, adding that it had been a long time since he had assumed a human form. As Baros gazed at Karnak, he remarked that Karnak's face looked scrawny and pompous, just like in the old days. In response, Karnak shot back that Baros still had no sense of respect. Karnak shifted the conversation and told Baros that if they had arrived at the right moment, they would be at the very beginning of everything. As he spoke, he noticed a book lying on the table and confirmed that they were indeed in the correct time period, the start of it all. He then mentioned that he had followed the path of necromancy using the knowledge from that very book. In that moment, Karnak decided to take action. He focused his magic and set the book ablaze right there on the table. Baros, witnessing this, asked Karnak if it was wise to have burned the book. Karnak assured him that it was fine since he had remembered everything from it anyway. Karnak then explained to Baros that the book was forbidden, but not much of its content was truly significant. He concluded that it was better to dispose of it rather than risk having to deal with it later. At that moment, Baros remarked that he had already planned everything out and added that Karnak looked more handsome than usual. This compliment filled Karnak with pride. However, just then, Baros's stomach began to grumble. Upon hearing the sound, Karnak noted that it had been a long time since he had heard such a noise, and Baros felt a rush of excitement at being hungry again. Karnak suggested they should find some food, and Baros eagerly agreed. As they entered the town and made their way to a local restaurant, their excitement filled the air with shouts of joy, exclaiming how delicious the food was. While eating, Karnak inquired about the secret behind the restaurant's barley bread, praising it as a masterpiece. Baros, delighted, relished the food he had longed to taste. Meanwhile, the other patrons looked on in confusion at the spectacle of the two. At that moment, both Karnak and Baros were overwhelmed with emotion, tears streaming down their faces. Baros exclaimed that the food was so good he could die for it. Wiping his tears away, Karnak reassured him that they weren't going to die, as he had revived them for a reason, so they could experience moments like this again. At that moment, Baros told Karnak that it was fortunate they had gambled their lives, as it had all been worth it. Holding his food, he added that the taste was so incredible it brought tears to his eyes, blurring his vision. Karnak nodded in understanding but cautioned Baros to watch how much he was eating, reminding him that money doesn't just fall from the sky. As he spoke, tears of joy streamed down his face from the exquisite flavors. Baros replied that Karnak should also slow down, but Karnak insisted he felt like fainting from joy just from the aroma of the food. Just then, a waiter emerged with a beautifully presented dish for another table, and both Karnak and Baros were taken aback by how delicious it looked. Karnak turned to Baros and asked if the food being served to the other customers was chicken. He was taken aback by the restaurant's upscale atmosphere. Baros, drawn in by the tempting aroma of the dishes, remarked on how delicious everything smelled and wondered aloud how much it might cost. Karnak, however, quickly replied that there was no way they could afford such luxurious food, explaining that he hailed from a fallen noble family. At that moment, a menacing smile crept across Karnak's face as he suggested to Baros that they could simply eliminate everyone in the restaurant to enjoy the food without restraint. Baros, panicking at the suggestion, quickly urged Karnak to reconsider, insisting that they shouldn't even think about it. He emphasized that given their current strength, they would likely end up beaten to a pulp. Karnak, upon hearing this, reluctantly agreed with Baros's assessment. Baros informed Karnak that he would check their remaining funds. As he rummaged through the bag where they kept their money, he lamented that it was not enjoyable being poor. However, at that moment, he was shocked by what he found inside the bag. Turning to Karnak, he said they had a problem. Concerned, Karnak asked him what the problem was. Baros then suggested that their time travel might have affected certain things. As Karnak glanced at the bag containing the money, he agreed, noting that the situation was definitely strange, given the amount of money inside. He pointed out to Baros that there was no way the two of them could possess this much money. At that moment, the bag was overflowing with silver coins. At that moment, Karnak began to wonder where things had gone wrong. As he reflected on his past, he recalled that his Jestard family had been facing financial difficulties and were poor at that time. His grandfather, Baron Grellet, had launched numerous businesses within their territory but failed in all of them, leaving only debts for Karnak's father, Baron Krapet. Unfortunately, Karnak's father lacked the ability to manage the ever-growing debts, and his original wife's two sons were useless brats who contributed nothing to the family. As the illegitimate child born into this crumbling household, Karnak endured scorn and persecution, barely managing to survive each day. At that moment, Karnak thought this was how his family's situation should have been in the present, but he was confused because that was not the case. He wondered where the money in the bag had come from. Karnak then told Baros that this was not something to celebrate and asked if the time-regressing spell had gone wrong. Baros replied that he was uncertain and added that, as a swordsman, he did not know much about such matters. This irritated Karnak, who thought to himself that they had not returned to the past, yet there were too many similarities with his memories. At that moment, as Karnak pondered the situation, Baros interrupted him, asking if this meant they could finally eat the chicken. Baros had been going crazy from the scent of the chicken since earlier. Hearing this, Karnak's expression changed, and he felt a surge of excitement. Baros then pointed out that worrying about their current situation was pointless, as their concerns wouldn't disappear just because they refrained from using the money. Karnak agreed with Baros and added that they needed to eat well to tackle their problems, suggesting they should order at least one chicken for themselves. Both of them were drooling at the thought of the meal. Karnak raised his voice and ordered the waiter to serve them 2 whole chickens each. After a short while, both of them were satisfied, having eaten to their heart's content. They were now riding on a horse, and Baros remarked that his stomach was full and he was on the verge of a food coma. Karnak added that he would be able to pass out and sleep once they got back. At that moment, Baros's expression changed as he told Karnak that the prospect of facing his family again was somewhat annoying, and he was not looking forward to seeing them, suspecting they might be just as they had always been. Karnak then noted that the two of them would be fine as long as they managed to ingratiate themselves with the family. He emphasized that the situation was quite strange. Baros agreed, pointing out that it wasn't just 1 or 2 things that were odd. He mentioned that the station manager they had encountered recently was also fawning over them, assuring them that he would make sure to feed their horses well. Baros added that it made no sense for a fallen family like theirs to have horses of such good breed. The citizens they encountered were also behaving strangely. The very people who once hated them and called them scoundrels were now overly enthusiastic to see them, even tearing up at the sight of Karnak and Baros. Karnak expressed his unease at this unexpected reception, and Baros remarked that they would learn more about the situation once they reached home. After a short while, they finally arrived, and Karnak, gazing at his house, noted that he hadn't seen the place in a while and felt a strange sense of nostalgia. In contrast, Baros felt annoyed, pointing out that he and Karnak had no good memories associated with that place. At that moment, Karnak remembered that Baros was also an orphan who had never lived a comfortable life. Baros's parents were absolute scumbags, and it was Karnak who found him dying alone in the middle of the night before they abandoned him. Karnak took Baros home, and surprisingly, his father allowed it. Karnak reflected that, despite being an illegitimate child, his family needed to save face, and having an attendant of sorts could have been the reason his father permitted Baros to stay with him. At that moment, Baros called out to Karnak, looking puzzled as he asked if the place they were in was really the Jestard residence. Karnak confirmed that it definitely was, but upon looking at the house again, he was surprised by its appearance. Baros then questioned whether they had come to the wrong place, but Karnak denied it, insisting that this area was indeed the location of his memories. As Karnak observed his surroundings, he noticed the house was enclosed by a tall brick wall, featured a two-story building with a terrace, and was surrounded by an extensive garden. Everything he saw matched his previous memories of the house, except for one striking difference: the house was surprisingly splendid. Karnak then told Baros that it seemed the house had been completely spruced up, and he wondered where the money was coming from and how his family had acquired so much wealth when he clearly remembered them being poor in his previous life. Just then, one of the guards noticed Karnak and greeted him, surprising Karnak since he had never experienced this kind of acknowledgement before. Another guard quickly informed the first guard that he was not greeting Karnak correctly, and at that moment, they greeted him again, referring to him as their lord. Both Karnak and Baros were shocked, realizing that Karnak, who had once been treated poorly by everyone, was now being addressed as their lord. A few moments later, the two of them found themselves inside one of the rooms in the house, where a butler named Japel Plate informed Karnak that it had already been half a year since he had become the head of the family. Karnak and Baros were shocked to learn that Karnak had held this position for 6 months. The butler then asked Karnak if he had achieved his goal, leaving Karnak confused about what goal the butler was referring to. Japel explained that it was because of this very goal that Karnak had gone on a journey. Hesitantly, Karnak replied that he had somehow completed his goal, even though he did not fully understand what it was. Upon hearing this, the butler was pleased and remarked that this was truly good news, adding that the late Lord and Isabella would have been glad to hear it. At that moment, both Karnak and Baros were shocked to learn that Karnak's father and stepmother had already died. Butler Japel then added that after Tessel and Ferelth had passed away as well, times had looked grim, but he was feeling much better now. Karnak realized at that moment why he was the lord of the house. He wondered why this had happened and why his entire family had died. Karnak thought to himself that the goal of his journey was becoming clear: it must have been to master necromancy while no one was watching. At that moment, Baros whispered to Karnak, expressing disbelief that Karnak would reveal his goal so honestly to the butler. Karnak agreed, explaining that he must have fabricated some stories during his journey. He questioned why he would need necromancy in a situation like this. Japel, in a cheerful manner, asked what was troubling them. Baros then informed Japel that young Master Karnak was feeling exhausted from the long journey and suggested they continue the conversation the next day. Upon seeing Karnak sitting in the chair looking weary, Japel immediately apologized for not considering his fatigue and added that Karnak should rest well in his room for the day. After the butler left, Karnak and Baros high-fived each other, and Karnak praised Baros for a job well done. Baros then pointed out that while they had escaped for now, he was unsure of what to do next since everything the butler said was so new that he no longer knew what was happening. At that moment, Karnak reminded Baros that there was a method they could use in times like this, and Baros immediately understood what Karnak meant. Karnak told Baros that they both knew what they needed to prepare, urging him to hurry up so they could move and act while everyone was still asleep. Moments later, night had fallen, and everyone was asleep except for Karnak and Baros. They were now in Butler Japel's room, preparing to do something suspicious. Baros observed Butler Japel, whispering to Karnak that he was completely asleep. He then took out a bowl and informed Karnak that he had prepared the herbs, although it had taken him quite a while to gather the ingredients. Karnak then took the bowl and told Baros that it was time to commence the mind inspection. At that moment, he uttered the words, "Awaken my servant," and the bowl filled with herbs erupted in a burst of purple flames. The smoke that accompanied the purple flame wafted into Butler Japel's nostrils, causing him to rise while still unconscious. His body became enveloped in a blue magical flame, and he referred to Karnak as his master. Karnak then asked Japel to explain the entire process of how the Jestard family's finances had improved and how he had become the head of the household. Still unconscious, Japel spoke, informing Karnak that 4 years ago, while the second young master was training, he had coincidentally discovered a large copper mine. Both Karnak and Baros were taken aback by this revelation. Karnak remarked that he had always thought mines were just an excuse nobles used to conceal dirty money. Baros agreed, stating that while that was true, it seemed this was a genuine case where they had actually found a mine. Karnak then continued by asking Japel about the reason everyone in the family had died in such a short span of 4 years. Japel explained that the issue stemmed from the location of the copper mine, which was situated in the neutrality zone between the Jestard family and the Deventer family. Both families claimed the mine as their own, leading to a conflict that escalated into war. The Deventers had always been diligent with their military training, and no one could defeat Sir Randolph from their side. As a result, Sir Randolph easily killed Baron Crappet in battle, as well as young Master Tessel, the oldest son of the family. The household's best knight, the second young Master Ferelth, lost both his legs to Sir Randolph, and in his despair, Ferelth took his own life. Japel then added that the Baroness was shocked by all of this and passed away not long after. In the end, young Master Karnak was chosen to be the successor despite being a minor, and the two families promised a ceasefire until Karnak came of age and could take over as head of the household. However, everyone was still concerned about the copper mine and the promise of compensation for the war. It was at this point that young Master Karnak devised a solution to save the family. He announced his request for a trial duel against Viscount Deventer in the name of Allium, the goddess of the moon and justice. Both Karnak and Baros were taken aback by the news of the duel request, while Baros expressed that it was an incredibly rash decision. The trial duel was conducted under the mandates of the Allium Order, allowing for the substitution of a warrior in one's stead. It took place in the presence of an Allium priest, and the victor was determined only when one side was completely defeated. Upon hearing this, Baros told Karnak that he had dug his own grave. Karnak, in a state of disbelief, insisted that it was not he who had made that decision, but the past version of himself. In that moment, he realized this was why everyone had favored him. Karnak then told Baros that it was a losing fight and that this was precisely why he must have chosen this path instead of continuing the war. Karnak then pointed out that Deventer could not refuse such an offer, as it would ruin their image if they did. He further explained that if he were to win the duel and secure the copper mine, it would help them avoid starvation. However, Baros warned Karnak that with his current skill level, he was bound to end up dead. In response, Karnak stated that this was precisely why he intended to prepare as thoroughly as possible for the duel. He then asked Japel when the duel was scheduled to take place, and Japel informed him that it would be held within a month. Both Karnak and Baros were shocked by this revelation, realizing that the duel was too close for comfort and that they were in serious trouble. Moments later, a feast was prepared early in the morning, and Baros was excited to see this, prompting him to ask Karnak what it was all for. Karnak explained that he had arranged the meal for Baros, acknowledging that he had always worked hard and deserved it. Thrilled by this gesture, Baros thanked Karnak for the meal. As he ate, Baros asked if it was okay for Karnak to be resting like this, given how close the duel was. Karnak smiled at this concern and suggested that Baros could duel in his place. Upon hearing this, Baros stopped eating, realizing the true reason behind Karnak's kindness. Baros then told Karnak that he now understood that this was all just bribery, and he apologized, stating that he would not duel in Karnak's place. In that moment, Karnak begged Baros to reconsider, emphasizing that Baros had already defeated 3 of the 4 martial kings. However, Baros replied that he had achieved those victories thanks to Karnak's necromancy, asserting that he could not gain martial prowess from experience alone. He explained that it was as meaningless to learn advanced swordsmanship without arms as it was to think he could succeed without proper training. Baros added that, given a year to train, he might have been able to compete, but with the duel scheduled in just a month, he refused to participate in a fight he was certain to lose. Upon hearing Baros's refusal, Karnak took away the food Baros was eating and told him that since he wouldn't be participating in the duel, he could no longer enjoy this special meal. Baros immediately protested, telling Karnak not to be so petty. He suggested that Karnak could find someone in the Night Order to take his place. However, Karnak responded that he wouldn't be in this predicament if there had been anyone talented enough in the Night Order. Baros then pointed out that there was only one option left for Karnak, and that was to use necromancy. Baros, reflecting on their past, told Karnak that he now understood why Karnak had chosen to study necromancy. However, Karnak interrupted, pointing out that there was a serious issue: necromancy was forbidden. He then reminded Baros of an incident from their past when they were both on the run, pursued by people who had been promised a blessing from Allium if they managed to capture them. Fortunately, Karnak and Baros had been able to eliminate the entire household discreetly using necromancy. Despite their efforts, the priest of Allium singled Karnak out, convinced that he was a necromancer. Karnak was strong enough to stand his ground against the priest of Allium, managing to fend them off. During their time on the run, Karnak wondered how the priest had discovered his ability to use necromancy, especially since the book had clearly stated that no one should be able to detect it. However, after carefully reading the book, Baros informed him that this rule only applied to civilians, mages, and knights, while priests were an exception. Karnak was both confused and shocked to learn that such a condition existed. In the present, Baros remarked that their past had been truly tortuous, to which Karnak responded that it was the beginning of a legend. Baros then mentioned that he understood the plan for the upcoming duel, but Karnak clarified that the plan was to use necromancy discreetly while pretending to engage in normal combat. The issue, however, was that the judges for the trial duel would be priests of Allium, and Karnak feared that using necromancy in front of them would be repeating the same mistake from the past. He didn't want to live a life constantly on the run again. Baros suggested they should simply gather some money, escape, and that he would retrieve all the jewels and funds. Karnak responded to Baros, saying that running away would be a shameful act, especially since all the family members he despised were already gone, and the people there actually liked him. Hearing this, Baros questioned why Karnak was maintaining the good image, suggesting that Karnak could go ahead with it while Baros prepared a funeral for him. Karnak insisted that it wasn't an act and expressed frustration at Baros making him seem like a villain when he wasn't. At that moment, Karnak had an idea and told Baros to sit down and listen, as what he was about to propose might sound dangerous, but it was a brilliant plan. In the northern fort of Deventer, knights were training rigorously when a voice commanded them to halt, announcing that they would take a short break. The man giving the orders was Sir Randolph, the strongest knight of Deventer. One of the knights, Sir Bright, then asked Sir Randolph how the preparations for the upcoming trial duel were progressing. Sir Randolph, hearing this, replied that no preparations were necessary against someone as unskilled as Karnak. Sir Bright agreed but cautioned Sir Randolph not to let his guard down, suggesting that Karnak might have some sort of plan to counter him. Randolph grumbled that it was ridiculous for him to waste his time on a spoiled, foolish young master like Karnak, who knew nothing about the world. He assured Bright that there was nothing to worry about. Bright agreed, saying he didn't believe for a moment that Randolph would lose, but he still pointed out that the new lord, Karnak, must have some kind of plan when he requested the duel. Just then, both of them heard a man in the distance speaking with his customers. As they glanced toward the source of the voice, Bright mentioned to Randolph that it was just a merchant and noted that there had been an increase in outsiders around the front yard lately. He added that it was becoming a distraction before ordering the knights to resume their training. Meanwhile, the merchant smiled at the scene, as he was none other than Baros in disguise, spying on them. Baros thought to himself that it had been a smart decision to snoop around where Randolph was training. As he observed Randolph's techniques, Baros realized that while Randolph might be strong in combat, in a one-on-one battle, his opponent actually stood a chance of winning. Baros noted that Randolph seemed like the typical foolish type who relied on basic heavy sword techniques. To make things even better, Randolph hadn't yet mastered battle aura. His movements were predictable, and this gave Baros a sense of confidence that it would work to his advantage. Baros acknowledged that despite Randolph's many weaknesses, a month might not be enough time to exploit them fully. As he was lost in thought, a woman approached from behind and asked why he was staring so intently at her brother, Randolph. Startled for a moment, Baros quickly composed himself, greeted the woman, and asked if she was indeed Randolph's sister. She confirmed this and repeated her question about his business with Randolph. Baros immediately replied that he was simply admiring the strength and vigor of the North's strongest knight. In that moment, Baros quickly shifted the conversation, telling Randolph's sister that their meeting was a coincidence, as he was a merchant selling handkerchiefs. He asked if she might be interested in one, adding that he would offer her a special price. As she examined the handkerchiefs, she found them appealing and remarked that they looked good. Baros complimented her, saying she had an excellent eye for quality. Though Baros was briefly worried that she might have caught on to his true intentions, he was relieved when she showed no sign of suspicion. Moments later, Baros returned to the Jestard estate and made his way to the personal drill hall to check on Karnak's training progress. Upon seeing Karnak, he called out that he had returned and asked how the stamina training was going. However, he was immediately taken aback to find Karnak lying on the floor, appearing lifeless. Baros rushed over, concern etched on his face, and urged Karnak to wake up. Karnak, on the other hand, groaned and told Baros not to shake him so much, or he would risk losing his meal. After a few moments, Karnak began to feel slightly better. At that time, Baros asked if Karnak had completed the 50 laps around the drill hall as instructed. Karnak replied that he had just finished but collapsed because he could not run any further. Observing Karnak, Baros noted that he was lacking significantly in stamina. Karnak then asked Baros if there was even a reason for him to train so rigorously in the first place. Baros responded that with a frail body like Karnak's, he wouldn't be able to accomplish anything at that moment. He reassured Karnak that the training was not meaningless and encouraged him to keep pushing forward. Still looking lifeless, Karnak insisted that he needed a break, but Baros refused, stating that they were going to begin the real stamina training right then. Karnak, surprised by this, asked what he had been doing all this time, to which Baros replied that he had just been undergoing rehabilitation. With a menacing smile, Baros added that the real training was about to start now. As time passed, Karnak had only 20 days left until the duel, and his training continued. The first task each morning was to ensure he had a filling breakfast. After that, Karnak would head to the drill hall to complete 100 push-ups, followed by 100 pole swings and 100 squats. Once he finished these exercises, he would take a short break. Despite looking lifeless after completing the workouts, the training had to press on. After the break, Karnak would eat another meat-heavy meal before resuming his push-ups, pole swings, and squats, repeating the process over and over. As time passed, only 15 days remained until the duel, and it was evident that Karnak had made significant improvements. He could be seen doing squats with 2 sacks of rice on his shoulders. At that moment, Baros approached and remarked that Karnak seemed to have finally built some stamina. Karnak responded that this was only to be expected after so much training, although he acknowledged that he still fell short compared to Baros. Just then, Baros informed Karnak that it was time to begin sword training. Karnak felt a surge of excitement at the thought of finally learning how to use a sword properly. Baros then instructed Karnak to hold the sword and, upon observing him, remarked that his grip was a mess. He noted that Karnak's hands were trembling and asked what he was staring at. Baros emphasized the need for Karnak to relax his shoulders while holding the sword, put more weight into his heels, bend his knees further, and tense his arms. Karnak thought to himself that Baros was quite strict. However, after correcting his posture, Baros finally said that Karnak was starting to look decent. He added that if Karnak could maintain this stance, he would not be beheaded in a single attack. Baros then informed Karnak that he was going to attack, prompting Karnak to prepare himself. Karnak declared that he would counter Baros's attack, but just as he said this, Baros launched a powerful strike. As the impact hit him, Karnak realized how strong and quick Baros was. Undeterred, Baros continued his assault, asking Karnak what he was doing and instructing him to return to his stance. At that moment, Karnak thought to himself that Baros's relentless barrage made it difficult to counter effectively. He concluded that his only option was to focus on maintaining his stance. At that moment, Baros delivered a powerful attack to Karnak, sending him flying to the ground. Baros explained that this was why knights could easily overpower civilians. He emphasized that knights wouldn't give their opponents a chance to counterattack and that Karnak needed to hold his stance and dodge the subsequent attacks. Karnak acknowledged Baros's point but admitted that even if he could maintain his stance, he wouldn't be able to dodge the next attack. Baros agreed with him but added that the goal of their training was to demonstrate Karnak's fighting spirit to Randolph. Karnak then asked Baros if it was necessary for him to do that during the duel. Baros explained that Randolph had a habit of showing off. He would try to display his skills in front of the spectators while toying with his opponents. However, if Randolph's opponents lost their will to fight, it would damage his honor, so he preferred to defeat them quickly. Baros added that Karnak needed to demonstrate to Randolph that he would not give up. By doing so, Karnak would increase his chances of survival in the duel. As time passed, Karnak now had only 5 days left until the duel. He continued to train hard with Baros, giving it his all, but he still struggled to match Baros's skill and often found himself sent flying to the ground. 4 days remained, then 3, and finally 2, during which Karnak began to show improvement. Baros acknowledged his progress, telling him he was doing well, but Karnak expressed his concern that he might die before even facing Randolph. Baros reassured him that he was on the right track and that he was almost ready for the duel. At that moment, Baros announced that it was time for them to enter the final phase of training. Baros then informed Karnak that he was going to teach him the 4 martial king's sword technique. Confused, Karnak asked what that technique was and if Baros truly knew it. Baros confirmed that he did, explaining that the 4 martial kings had all been his underlings and that he had learned their techniques, except for that of martial king Rapisal. Curious, Karnak inquired why Baros had not learned Rapisal's technique. Baros replied that it was because Karnak had not turned her into a death knight. Rapisal had resisted until the end, and as a result, Karnak had cut her into thirds and made her a palace gatekeeper. At that moment, Karnak recalled what he had done to Rapisal and wondered if he had truly been that cruel in his past. Baros then told Karnak that he was going to learn Martial King Levune's Delphiod sword technique that day. Karnak expressed doubt, asking if it was really possible to master such a skill in just 2 days, given that it belonged to a martial king. Baros reassured him that he would not need 2 days. In fact, Karnak only needed 1 day to learn the technique. Time passed, and it was now the day of the duel. At the border of Deventer and Gestard, an arena had been set up for the duel. A crowd gathered in the area, eager to witness the upcoming confrontation. People were conversing among themselves, speculating on who would win the duel. One spectator from the Deventer side confidently declared that Sir Randolph would be the obvious victor but expressed a hope that the match wouldn't turn out to be boring and would instead be at least somewhat entertaining. Meanwhile, spectators from the Gestard side were concerned about Karnak's chances. One person asked if Karnak would win the duel, while another reassured them, saying they had heard that Karnak had been training very hard and that they simply had to believe in him. At that moment, Karnak and Baros arrived at the duel venue, both looking confident. As the crowd continued chatting, the priest of Allium stepped forward and instructed everyone to be quiet in the presence of the goddess. He announced that both houses had laid claim to the copper mines, prompting the request for this trial. The priest explained that ownership of the mine would be determined through combat. He then called for Karnak of House Gestard to step forward and face the goddess, followed by Sir Randolph of Deventer, who also came forward to stand before the priest. The priest added that before the fight commenced, a handicap in equipment would be applied based on the fighter's abilities, in accordance with the rules. The priest then asked both fighters if they were willing to pledge to fight honorably in the name of Allium, to which they both responded affirmatively. The priest continued, stating that with the warrior's pledge, may the scales of justice seek out the truth. At that moment, he announced that the trial by combat would begin, and Karnak and Randolph faced each other. Just then, Randolph launched an attack at Karnak, declaring that nothing would change, as he was destined to emerge victorious. Karnak, however, successfully blocked Randolph's strikes and retorted that they would only know the outcome once they both saw things through to the end. Randolph retreated momentarily and acknowledged that Karnak was not just all talk since he had managed to block his attacks. As the fight continued, the Gestard supporters grew excited, noting that their lord, Karnak, was putting up a decent fight. One of them remarked that there was something different about Karnak that day. Baros, observing from the sidelines, thought to himself that the match was progressing as expected. He noted that Randolph's attacks were not particularly fast or threatening, indicating that Randolph was still assessing Karnak's abilities. Meanwhile, Karnak felt a surge of confidence and reminded himself to stick to his training. At that moment, he resolved to show both the spectators and Randolph his unwavering will to fight. At that moment, Karnak screamed in anger, challenging Randolph to come at him. Randolph smiled upon hearing this and thought to himself that Karnak's eyes were filled with determination. Although he recognized that Karnak's skills were lacking, he admired his spirit. Randolph then told Karnak that he was going to take it up a notch. As he increased his sword energy, Karnak felt a surge of panic, realizing that he would not be able to block the impending attack with his shield. At that moment, as Randolph prepared to deliver a powerful attack, Karnak rolled out of the way, successfully dodging the blow. Randolph was taken aback by the crude skill Karnak had just displayed. The audience, equally impressed and surprised, marveled at Karnak's ability to evade the attack. Some remarked that they had never seen such skill before, while others praised their lord Karnak for his dexterity. Seizing the moment, Karnak threw aside his shield and declared that Randolph was nothing, insisting he didn't even need it to face him. He added that Randolph was so slow he had momentarily thought of him as a turtle. Karnak then taunted Randolph, suggesting he should be embarrassed to be called a knight while resembling a muscular pig. Randolph, enraged by the insult, vowed to silence Karnak for mocking him. However, Karnak responded confidently, telling Randolph to do his worst, as it would not deter him. At that moment, Karnak assumed a stance that shocked Randolph. It was the stance of the Delphiod sword technique. The spectators gasped at the sight, realizing that Karnak had adopted a stance associated with one of the four martial kings. They were thrilled at the possibility that Karnak might have been training with the techniques of the martial kings. The people on the Jestard side now felt a surge of hope that their lord, Karnak, might be able to win. Meanwhile, Randolph smiled to himself, realizing he had almost fallen for Karnak's taunt. He resolved to remain calm and focused. The sword techniques of the martial kings could only be wielded by geniuses with true battle experience, and Karnak was far from being capable of using them effectively. Randolph contemplated how Karnak had managed to learn the technique, but he believed it would not aid him in achieving victory in their fight. While Randolph acknowledged Karnak's effort in attempting to use the martial king's technique, he was confident that Karnak would not be able to defeat him that easily. Randolph pointed his sword at Karnak, declaring that he would enact justice in the name of Allium. Seeing Randolph glaring at him, Karnak felt a surge of panic, realizing that his current abilities might not be enough to take Randolph down. He recalled the time he had asked Baros whether it was possible to learn such a technique in just one day, given that it belonged to one of the four martial kings. Baros had assured him that he only needed to roughly copy the technique, but Karnak remained doubtful. Baros had further added that once this was over, Karnak wouldn't have to pick up a sword again. All he needed to do was demonstrate enough skill to convince everyone that he had been training, as their real plan lay elsewhere. Back in the present, Karnak questioned Baros about why he hadn't warned him that he would be beaten so badly by Randolph. However, he quickly changed his attitude, realizing that he still needed to focus on what needed to be done. Despite the pain and tears from the beating, Karnak defiantly told Randolph that this was nothing, insisting that it wouldn't be enough for Randolph to defeat the bloodline of House Jestard. Randolph, observing Karnak's battered state, couldn't comprehend his words. In that moment, Karnak declared that the sword of Jestard would never fall. As the battle continued, the spectators were moved by Karnak's actions and regretted having viewed him as incapable. The supporters from House Jestard were now emotional, shedding tears and expressing that even if Karnak was not the brightest, he was more than suitable to be their lord. Meanwhile, Baros wore a menacing smile, pleased that Karnak was avoiding direct hits and noting that all the time spent training him had paid off. He reflected on how Karnak had always had a knack for talking back, and even while being beaten, Karnak continued to taunt Randolph. Randolph, feeling increasingly irritated, thought to himself that he could not keep this up much longer. He then addressed Karnak, who was barely standing, and remarked that Karnak looked as if he were on his last breath, questioning why he was still talking back. Randolph charged at Karnak, declaring that it was time to end the fight. Baros, witnessing this, felt a surge of excitement and immediately shouted for Karnak to prepare himself. At that moment, Karnak wondered if this was indeed his time. He recalled Baros's words during training, where Baros had warned him that even if he could mimic the martial king's moves, without delivering a proper strike, everyone would see through his tricks. Baros instructed Karnak on exactly what he needed to do. He explained that Randolph would target Karnak's legs to end the fight, aiming to limit his movement. Baros emphasized that at the right moment, Karnak should shift into a defensive stance and stab his sword into the ground. Remembering this, Karnak followed the instructions precisely and successfully blocked Randolph's attack. Randolph was taken aback that a newcomer like Karnak could withstand his strike. Karnak recalled Baros's guidance to follow up by swinging his sword upward in a diagonal arc. As he executed this move, he switched his grip and struck again, managing to land a blow on Randolph and injure him. However, upon receiving the attack, Randolph laughed at Karnak and taunted him, asking if that was all he had. He added that a kitten's scratch would have been more effective. At that moment, Karnak felt the weight of the situation and wondered if this was the end for him. The spectators began to think that the fight was coming to a close. They murmured that miracles might not exist and that reality was both cruel and unfair. Randolph then told Karnak that he had let his guard down, certain that Karnak would be ridiculed by his peers. In response, Karnak asserted that he was risking his life in this duel, while all Randolph had to offer was mock concern. Karnak smiled darkly and told Randolph that the situation wasn't as dire as it seemed, adding that he wouldn't have to feel sorry for him afterward. Randolph was taken aback by Karnak's unsettling expression, and at that very moment, a black aura began to seep from the wound Karnak had inflicted earlier. Shocked, Randolph stared in disbelief as the eerie energy radiated from his body. The priest, witnessing the strange phenomenon, was equally stunned, while Randolph struggled to comprehend what the black aura meant, his confusion growing as the mysterious force continued to escape from him. Karnak shouted at Randolph, declaring that he didn't care what dirty tricks Randolph had up his sleeve, he was determined not to lose. With that, Karnak charged at Randolph. However, at that very moment, Randolph unleashed a powerful kick that sent Karnak flying backward. Confused, Randolph noticed that his legs seemed to move on their own. The audience gasped in shock, marveling at the immense strength displayed by a human. They began to wonder if the black aura surrounding Randolph was somehow under his control. At that moment, Baros raised his voice, accusing Randolph of using necromancy, calling it the power of the devil. The shock rippled through the crowd, and the priest quickly commanded the guards to defeat Randolph. Without hesitation, the priest and the knights charged at him, the priest demanding that Randolph cease his actions in the name of Allium. He declared that, to bring justice against unclean beings like Randolph, he must lay down his sword and surrender. But Randolph, bewildered by the accusations, instinctively swung his hand, unleashing a wave of black aura that hurled the priest and knights backward. The priest declared that this was undoubtedly necromancy and urged everyone to stop Randolph immediately. Meanwhile, Randolph, confused and disoriented, wondered what was happening to him and what Karnak had done. Karnak, observing the chaos with a smile, amplified the black aura surrounding Randolph, and in that moment, the dark energy began to engulf him entirely. One of the knights suggested to the priest that it seemed like Randolph was being controlled by a curse, but the priest responded that it was simply because Randolph lacked the skill to control the black aura. He grimly added that they had no choice but to kill Randolph when the opportunity presented itself. In a moment of panic, Randolph let out a desperate scream, and seizing the opportunity, the priest and knights swiftly struck him down, killing him instantly. After a few moments, the knights checked Randolph's lifeless body and informed the priest that he was no longer breathing. They asked what their next steps should be. The priest instructed them to send officials to Viscount Devonter's estate to conduct a thorough investigation into the matter. He then announced that a verdict had been reached. Since Devonter's fighter had called upon dark powers and used them during the holy trial, it was a disgrace to the name of their goddess. As a result, Karnak's fighter, Baron of Gestard, was declared the victor. Moments later, at Viscount Devonter's estate, the priests were searching through the house when one of them announced that they had found what they were looking for. The priest revealed that there were blankets and cloaks bearing necromancy symbols, along with further evidence scattered throughout the estate. Randolph's sister, distraught, insisted to the priests that there was no way Randolph could have been practicing necromancy. She explained that all the items they had found were things they had recently purchased from a merchant. The priest then turned to her and questioned the suspicious bottle of medicine he had just discovered in Randolph's room. Randolph's sister, upon seeing the bottle, told the priest there was nothing suspicious about it, explaining that it was just a hair growth formula they had purchased from a merchant since Randolph had always been concerned about his hair loss. However, before she could finish, the priest interrupted her, stating that all these items were clear evidence of necromancy. He added that a hearing would soon be held, leaving Randolph's sister in shock. A few days later, at the estate of Jestard, Karnak asked Baros how he found the feast, noting it was a meal prepared for champions. Baros responded that it was incredible, far better than the food he had eaten during training, and he could feel chills just from enjoying the meal. Karnak nodded in agreement with Baros, remarking that the feast was indeed a celebration of their victory. Baros, still unsure, asked if it was really appropriate for them to indulge like this, but Karnak reassured him, mentioning that there was likely a similar feast happening in the town square. Karnak went on to explain that he had to do whatever it took to secure their win, and it had only worked so well because of Randolph's fiery nature. 1 month earlier, Baros had been questioning Karnak's plan, particularly when Karnak mentioned his intention to use necromancy during the duel. Baros asked if Karnak was truly serious about it. Karnak urged him to listen first, explaining that it made little difference whether he died from being caught using necromancy or during the trial itself. Given that choice, Karnak reasoned it was better to use necromancy to his advantage. Karnak gave an evil smile and told Baros that he wouldn't be the one using necromancy and added that it would be Randolph. Surprised, Baros asked what Karnak had planned. Karnak explained that he intended to stage an act during the duel. With the officials positioned far from the arena, Karnak believed he could easily deceive them. In the midst of their battle, it would be difficult for anyone to tell who was actually casting the spell. Karnak then told Baros that the spell he planned to use would be an incredibly powerful, high-level necromancy spell, one so potent that even the Order wouldn't suspect him. He added that none of them would ever consider Karnak capable of such advanced magic, as they underestimated his abilities. Upon hearing this, Baros reassured Karnak that there was nothing to worry about if things were as Karnak described. However, Karnak admitted there was one issue, and it was that he needed his opponent to spill some blood for the spell to work. The problem was, with his current skills, Karnak doubted whether his blade could even get close to wounding Randolph. Hearing this, Baros smiled with excitement and confidently told Karnak that if he only needed Randolph to bleed a little, he could help make that happen without any trouble. In the present, Karnak remarked to Baros that the past month had been a miserable experience for him. Baros, however, told him he should be grateful for the effort he put in, as it had ultimately paid off. Baros, feeling something was peculiar, asked Karnak why Randolph hadn't been able to win without resorting to necromancy, especially since they had managed to avoid suspicion. He pointed out that all the priests did was conduct an investigation against Devonter's estate. Karnak explained that the investigators were convinced Randolph had used necromancy. Baros then questioned why they were so certain that Randolph, and not someone else, was the one using the dark magic. At the Gisellan Grand Temple of the Order of Allium, a head priest was questioning another priest about the investigation into Devonter's dark power, emphasizing that this was a significant issue. The second priest responded that, based on their experience and investigation, they were certain of their findings. Holding a bottle filled with a peculiar fragment, he explained that this was not the work of an ordinary necromancer. He further stated that the goddess had warned them that the attributes of the fragment matched perfectly, identifying it as the darkness of the apocalypse. Meanwhile, Karnak smiled to himself, feeling that luck was on his side in this lifetime. Baros remarked that the world was in their favor, to which Karnak responded that all they needed to do now was enjoy their lives to the fullest, as that was what second lives were all about. Baros then pointed out that with the Devonter family now gone, many powers would attempt to seize control of their minds. Karnak agreed, noting that this was precisely why he needed to strengthen his necromantic abilities. Hearing this, Baros grew worried and asked what they would do if the Order discovered their use of necromancy. With a smile, Karnak explained that this was exactly why he needed to devise a way to practice necromancy without being caught. 3 months later, Karnak was in his room, practicing necromancy. He reminded himself to focus, and at that moment, he recited a mantra: negative energy from the moonlight, darkness of the deep night, call upon the corrupt energy, filter it, and collect only the pure essence behind, sorting through and reprocessing it to create magic. As he completed the recitation, Karnak successfully gathered all the dark energy into a concentrated ball. In that moment, he achieved his goal and successfully created chaos magic. In a different part of the training area, Baros continued to train with another soldier. As he sparred, he reflected that it had already been 3 months since he began his training to become a soldier. To achieve his goal of becoming an official Knight of Gestard, he realized he had no choice but to persist. However, he was troubled by the fact that the abilities of the soldiers were lacking, a realization that struck him while sparring with a senior Gestard soldier named Guillemon. Breathing heavily and clearly struggling, Guillemon suggested they call it a day, and Baros agreed. At that moment, Baros smiled and thanked Guillemon for his time. Guillemon responded that Baros's words were making him feel embarrassed, as he believed it was he who needed to learn from Baros now. Guillemon then remarked on how much Baros had grown, predicting that he would soon become the strongest Knight of Gestard. Feeling a bit embarrassed, Baros replied that he still had a long way to go compared to Guillemon. In response, Guillemon called Baros very modest and assured him that he would definitely make a good knight. Guillemon then mentioned that the soldiers were going out for drinks that day and asked if Baros wanted to join them. However, Baros explained that he had been assigned an important task by the young master and would not be able to join them. Upon hearing Baros's response, Guillemon expressed his disappointment that Baros could not join them but quickly added that it was fine. He bid farewell to Baros, suggesting they meet again the following day, and Baros agreed. A few moments later, Baros entered Karnak's room with a bright smile, holding breakfast for him. However, he was suddenly met with a startling sight, a massive flame hurtling directly toward him. Shocked, Baros managed to dodge it just in time. Karnak then reminded Baros to knock before entering his room, as it could be dangerous. In response, Baros asked Karnak about the technique he had just used, noting that it did not appear to be necromancy at all. Karnak, upon hearing this, acknowledged Baros's sharpness, agreeing that it was difficult to classify the technique he had used as necromancy. He explained that the technique was more akin to manipulating mana. In response, Baros pointed out that it would only be possible for Karnak to use mana if he switched his power. There are 4 ways to transcend human capabilities in the world: a knight's battle aura, a mage's mana, a cleric's divinity, and necromancy, which involves the forces of death and darkness. The transcendent force accumulates only the energy suitable for the individual's body. Once enough energy has been gathered, it transforms into a so-called power. This power is optimized to suit the user's body and inherent traits, making it impossible for someone to wield another kind of power once their soul has been endowed with a specific type. Baros then remarked that once a person chose a power, they could not change to another type. Karnak, upon hearing this, explained that he had not changed his power, rather, it was simply at its second stage. Baros was confused by this revelation, as he had not known that Karnak's power had a second stage and could change. Karnak further clarified that necromancy, which utilized death energy and corrupt energy, was essentially a very dirty form of mana. He noted that this was why he was able to work effectively with necromancy, given his troubled upbringing. Karnak also mentioned that there were foods made through similar processes, such as fermented foods. Relating this to necromancy, he explained that the power had also been processed to avoid feeling gross or dirty. Karnak then explained that by filtering out originally negative emotions such as hate and grudges and retaining only the pure energy of darkness and death, he could transform it into mana. He told Baros that this process was how his chaos mana was formed, and its appearance was similar to that of normal mana. Baros then remarked that now that Karnak had mentioned it, chaos mana did feel closer to normal mana. Karnak responded that with this understanding, it would now be possible for him to pretend to be a mage. However, Baros asked if Karnak would be able to replicate the strength he had before with chaos mana. In response, Karnak explained that with too much power, a significant incident could occur, so all he needed now was enough strength to protect the territory. In the western forest of Gestard territory, a knight could be heard telling his comrades that they had successfully captured all the monsters in the mines. The head knight then congratulated everyone on a job well done and instructed them to prepare for extraction. However, just as he was speaking, a monster appeared from behind and attacked Guillemon. At that moment, Baros intervened and defeated the creature with a single slash. Baros then asked Guillemon if he was okay. Grateful for the timely rescue, Guillemon thanked Baros and expressed his reassurance now that an official knight like him was present. With a smile, Baros told Gilliman that it had not even been a month since he became a knight, and he still felt awkward and embarrassed being referred to as one. He then shifted the topic and asked Gilliman about the strange state of the monsters he had mentioned earlier. Gilliman confirmed that Baros was correct, explaining that the Snarl monsters had grown twice as strong as before and that he believed the rumors were true. Baros inquired about the rumors Gilliman was referring to, and Gilliman explained that he was talking about the goddess, Oracle. The Oracle of Destruction was sent down to the Order by the 7 goddesses who protect the world and humanity. Emptiness would open its mouth and spew forth the forbidden faith. This darkness would erase light and reap life. In time, hardships would emerge, and corrupted beasts would gain twisted power, causing the dead to awaken and wander the forsaken lands. The King of Death would descend, painting the world with blood and tears, becoming the harbinger of destruction. Following the goddess, Oracle, monsters from a nearby continent ran rampant, and necromancers became uncontrollable, leading to widespread chaos. In response, the continent's religious orders announced the Oracle to prevent further disorder and began to fight against these threats under the blessings of the goddess, seeking to protect the world. At that moment in Karnak's office, Baros told Karnak that there had been no Oracle before regression and asked why the past was continuously changing. Karnak, feeling annoyed, expressed frustration at their lack of information regarding the situation. Baros then pointed out that the rumors seemed to be about the two of them and asked Karnak if this was related to him. Karnak clarified that the time period did not align, explaining that the Oracle had occurred long before their regression. Baros, looking worried, remarked that this was why the Randolph incident had been swept aside so easily. He then questioned whether they needed to take action since the world was collapsing. Karnak then told Baros that there was nothing the two of them, being from the countryside, could do. He admitted that he did not know who the King of Death was in the current time but expressed doubt that the world could be destroyed so easily, noting that he and Baros had tried to prevent this before their regression. Baros replied that there were many heroes who would be able to figure out something regarding the situation. Karnak agreed, suggesting they trust the forces of the world and simply stay in their territory to enjoy the life they were currently living. 7 days later, a man from the Order of Latiel, the goddess of the sun, came to meet Karnak. He expressed his desire for Karnak's cooperation in a pressing matter, while Karnak and Baros looked troubled by the situation and thought to themselves that they were in trouble. The man then revealed that they had discovered a necromancer who had been active in Departh City and had fled to Gestard. They believed the necromancer was hiding in the nearby forest, so the man requested a guide who was familiar with the area. At that moment, Baros thought to himself that he and Karnak should naturally reject the man's request. However, Karnak had a different plan and surprised Baros by expressing his willingness to help, stating that he could not turn down matters concerning the goddess. Baros was left confused by Karnak's response. Karnak then assured the man that they would send someone to assist him promptly. The man thanked Karnak for his cooperation and bid him farewell. After the man had left, Baros, looking irritated, asked Karnak why he had decided to intervene in worldly matters when he thought they were not going to do so. Karnak responded that this was a good opportunity to gain insight into the situation. Baros then inquired what Karnak planned to do once they found the necromancer. At that moment, Karnak wore a sinister expression and told Baros that they would capture the necromancer first and then deal with him harshly. As night fell, the necromancer continued to flee through the forest, wondering if he had successfully evaded all his pursuers. As the necromancer ran, he thought to himself that he had finally escaped the life of a beggar, but he was mistaken, as pursuers were still on his trail. At that moment, he resolved to survive this situation and exact revenge on those who had wronged him. At that moment, a bright light illuminated the area as knights surrounded the necromancer, declaring that his escape was over and that he should stop running, as it was futile. The necromancer pondered why he had been able to evade the knights so easily before, only to realize that they had been biding their time, planning to trap him when he least expected it. The knights warned the necromancer that they would not tolerate any further disturbances and demanded his immediate surrender. However, the necromancer declared that he would not be captured so easily. In that instant, he activated his power and summoned a wraith. The knights were initially shocked by the appearance of the wraith, but quickly regained their composure. One of the knights instructed the others to draw their protective charms to guard against the wraith's attack. At that moment, the necromancer commanded the wraith to charge at the knights. At a distance, two figures perched on a tree, observing the battle unfold. It was Karnak and Baros. Karnak, watching the fight, felt irritation bubbling within him and expressed his frustration to Baros, stating that the necromancer was reciting the incantations incorrectly and executing the spell techniques poorly. Baros remarked that the necromancer clearly had not learned the standard procedures and suggested they prepare to intervene. Pointing at the fleeing necromancer, Baros urged Karnak to start moving. With a smile, Karnak replied that they needed to get ahead of the knights before they subdued the necromancer. After a few moments, the necromancer reached the interior of a cave. Having escaped from the knights, he realized he had expended more energy than he had anticipated and knew he needed to hide. As he moved deeper into the cave, he sensed a nearby warmth. The necromancer decided to start a fire for warmth, but as he approached, he was taken aback to find two men warming themselves, and it was none other than Karnak and Baros. Karnak then informed the necromancer that they had been waiting for him and had begun to worry because he was late. Karnak then remarked that the necromancer had a keen eye for finding this cave, as it was their usual hideout. The necromancer, confused, asked who the two of them were, but Karnak shifted the conversation, warning the necromancer that there were people out to get him. Angered by Karnak and Baros' interference, the necromancer summoned his servants to confront them. The necromancer quickly calculated his options, thinking that he could use his summoned servants to buy enough time for his escape. Meanwhile, Baros, noticing the number of spirits surrounding them, remarked to Karnak that the necromancer had summoned quite a few. Concerned, Baros asked what their plan would be, especially since his sword couldn't cut through the ethereal forms of the spirits. Karnak, calm and confident, told Baros to stay put. This was the perfect opportunity for Karnak to test his chaos mana, and with a hint of excitement, he prepared to take action. The necromancer had just exited the cave, confident that Karnak and Baros would be preoccupied with his summoned servants. However, within moments, a massive explosion rocked the cave, sending spirits flying in all directions. The necromancer was stunned by the unexpected blast. Just then, Karnak and Baros emerged from the cave, and Karnak called out to the necromancer, asking where he thought he was running off to. With a swift gesture, Karnak unleashed his spell, Conceal and Explode, effectively dealing with all of the necromancer's servants in a single, powerful strike. Upon witnessing this, the necromancer realized that Karnak and Baros were stronger than he had anticipated and concluded that he would soon be caught. In a moment of desperation, he shouted in anger, declaring that he would reveal to them the true power of death. He then summoned a spirit known as an evil spirit. Baros remarked to Karnak that the young ones were overflowing with energy, while Karnak felt irritation at the necromancer's misnaming of the creature, pointing out that its true name was Wraith. With a smug smile, the necromancer taunted Karnak, claiming to see fear etched on his face. This only annoyed Karnak further, as he was not scared at all of the necromancer or his summoned spirits. The necromancer declared that it was too late for Karnak and Baros to beg for their lives and then sent the wraith charging toward them. However, Karnak's expression shifted dramatically as he raised his voice, commanding the wraith to kneel. To the necromancer's astonishment, the wraith immediately obeyed. In that moment, the necromancer realized that Karnak had been a necromancer all along. Karnak responded to the necromancer by stating that he was utterly clueless, having only just figured it out. He then added that the necromancer would soon be unaware of what Karnak was about to do. With that, Karnak raised his hand and cast the spell Misdirection *. In an instant, a massive green hand enveloped in aura materialized above the necromancer and swiftly grabbed him, preventing any chance of escape. Moments later, the necromancer fell unconscious. At that moment, Karnak cast a spell, enveloping the necromancer in a blue aura, placing him under Karnak's control. Karnak then commanded the necromancer to get up, and the necromancer complied without hesitation. Karnak then asked the necromancer how he had acquired his necromancy powers. The necromancer replied that it was merely a stroke of luck. He explained that he was drowning his sorrows in the streets as usual when suddenly a darkness from an alley engulfed him. An unknown power began to course through his body, and in that moment, the necromancer realized it was the authority of the apocalypse, as foretold by prophecy. The necromancer then added that with such power available for the taking, he did not hesitate for even a second. He explained that using the powers was easy, which allowed him to grow stronger. Additionally, he mentioned that with his newfound abilities, he killed all the people he disliked. Karnak, upon hearing that, told the necromancer to stop, as he did not want to hear the story of a random necromancer. Baros then asked Karnak if he was planning to mind control the necromancer and make it look like the necromancer had killed himself with his own dagger. Karnak confirmed that this was indeed his plan. Moments later, the necromancer was dead, and Karnak approached him to start absorbing his powers. Baros, witnessing this, was surprised and asked Karnak why he was taking the necromancer's power, as he was supposed to avoid dirty energy like this. Karnak informed Baros that they needed to investigate further, as the search party was approaching. He mentioned that he would only absorb a small portion of the necromancer's power to avoid drawing attention, noting that their battle had already caused too much noise, and the knights would arrive any moment. While the knights were still searching for the necromancer at a distance, Karnak sensed something strange as he began absorbing the necromancer's power. Baros, noticing this, asked if Karnak was all right. Karnak responded that something felt off, but they decided to deal with it later, as the knights were closing in and they needed to retreat. A few days later, Karnak and Baros met at the office, where Karnak had placed a special barrier around them to ensure their conversation remained private. Seeing the barrier, Baros questioned whether it was truly necessary, wondering if the situation was serious enough to warrant a soundproof shield. Karnak, with a grave expression, explained that this was no ordinary matter. He had taken a closer look at the power he had absorbed the other day. Baros, intrigued, asked if Karnak had discovered anything. Karnak, visibly troubled, revealed that he had uncovered something unsettling. He himself was the reason the necromancer had gained access to the power of necromancy. Baros, hearing this, told Karnak that it didn't align with the timeline of their arrival. Karnak admitted he had no idea how it had occurred either, but revealed that the necromancer's power he had absorbed was an exact match to his own. Baros, still in disbelief, struggled to comprehend what Karnak was saying. Karnak then asked if Baros remembered why they had chosen regression over possession. Baros replied that the bodies they had possessed couldn't handle the immense spiritual power they carried. Karnak confirmed this, adding that they both had far too much power and had tried to force themselves into bodies unable to contain their spiritual energy. Karnak went on to explain that, since possession had failed, they had chosen to abandon their powers and separate their souls from their bodies, allowing them to regress back into their original forms for a better chance of success. However, he suspected that he hadn't fully left his power in the future. When he left his living body and used energy to create the Astra Shantief, he became something that was neither fully physical nor entirely spiritual. As a result, his necromancy powers had bound themselves to his spirit rather than his body, and those powers crossed into the past along with his soul. Karnak added that because of this, his body could no longer handle the strain and must have released most of that power. Baros was stunned to learn that Karnak's powers had also traveled with them into the past. Karnak then explained that the energy expelled from his body had become the source of the darkness known as the End. Concerned, Baros pointed out that even if Karnak's power had been scattered, its return could still destroy the world. He silently reflected that their current life was now doomed, and it seemed hopeless. Baros then suggested that perhaps Karnak could simply recall the powers that had been released. Karnak, looking perplexed, explained that it wasn't that simple. Just as a coin dropped on the ground wouldn't return on its own, his scattered powers couldn't be easily summoned back. Baros, feeling overwhelmed and unsure of what to do, told Karnak that they were doomed because of his actions. Karnak admitted that he had already ruined the world once and was on the verge of doing it again, expressing deep regret over the situation. He then stated that the outcome was clear and they had to find a way to fix it. Baros, frustrated, remarked that he had thought they were going to live an easy life and now asked Karnak what their next steps would be. Karnak responded that he needed to investigate the other manifestations of the darkness known as the End. Exhausted, Baros sighed, saying it looked like they were back to living out of sacks. Karnak reassured him that he would ensure Baros was well fed, adding that he didn't want to be in this situation any more than Baros did. The next day, Karnak and Baros were on the road, riding their horse. Baros commented that being out here didn't feel so bad, noting that it might be because they weren't being chased like in their previous life. Karnak, hearing this, agreed, remarking that they had faced quite a lot of trouble back then. Baros added that there were no signs of bandits this time, which was a relief, as they used to be harassed by them frequently in their past life. Karnak pointed out that they now looked like they had support, unlike before when they appeared poor, so bandits wouldn't dare approach them. Baros, with a grin, remarked that money was certainly helpful, especially in situations like this. Baros then asked Karnak to confirm if they were heading to Durarth. Karnak explained that they were, as it was where the last necromancer they had caught had obtained his powers. He added that they might uncover some clues by investigating the source of the necromancer's abilities. Baros remarked that their current situation still felt somewhat unplanned and pointed out that the darkness of the end wouldn't just come to them on its own. He then asked Karnak if he had any sort of tracking magic. Karnak admitted that he didn't have a specific plan, saying they would have to handle things the old-fashioned way. He then asked Baros if he still remembered the places they visited before the regression, just as they arrived in front of Durarth, their destination. Karnak and Baros stood before the Durarth Adventure Guild. Karnak remarked that this was the best place to gather information, noting that they had access to all kinds of valuable details. Baros recalled how, in the past, they had successfully laundered their identities as adventurers, which had been useful, even though they were frequently hunted as wanted criminals. Karnak reassured him that things would be different this time, and there was no need for them to become adventurers again. Inside the guild, as they approached the counter, Karnak handed over a generous amount of money to the receptionist in exchange for information. Overjoyed by the large sum, the receptionist's face lit up with happiness. With a bright smile, the receptionist welcomed them to the Durarth Adventurer Guild and asked if they were seeking information about the darkness of the end. Baros stepped forward and explained that they were looking for details about the increasing number of monsters in the territory, as Karnak, being the lord of the land, needed to stay informed about everything happening. The receptionist then mentioned that there had been quite a few recent requests concerning the darkness of the end, allowing the guild to gather a substantial amount of information on the subject. She pulled out a large stack of books and handed them over, suggesting they start by going through those for relevant details. Karnak and Baros were stunned at the sheer number of books placed in front of them. As they searched through the information, Karnak and Baros found themselves in trouble. They realized that much of it was false. One piece detailed a scam incident, while another recounted a dog that had eaten a chicken. To their disbelief, people were even blaming the darkness of the end for a woman fleeing her abusive husband. They could hardly believe that this was the information meant to help them. Noticing their frustration, the receptionist remarked that they seemed unable to find anything useful. He offered to filter out the irrelevant details for them, but Karnak declined, insisting that they wanted access to all the information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, as the more detailed, the better. Baros told Karnak that they didn't need to go through all the pages, but just then, Karnak placed his hand on Baros's shoulder and explained that he would use magical messaging to facilitate stealthy conversations between them, given the number of people around. Karnak added that important information was often hidden among seemingly useless documents. Hearing this, Baros felt a sense of burden, realizing that the process would take longer than he had anticipated. While they continued their discussion, a man behind them spoke loudly, urging those nearby to believe what he was saying. The man insisted that he was serious and claimed there was an evil necromancer in town. He approached the receptionist, stating that he needed to file a report since no one was taking him seriously. The receptionist was taken aback by the mention of a necromancer in the area and asked the man if he had already discussed the situation with the temple. The man angrily replied that the people at the temple wouldn't believe him either. In response, the receptionist urged the man to explain the situation in more detail. The man began recounting his story, explaining that some time ago, a foreigner named Cleo had arrived in their town and taken up residence in an abandoned mansion. He added that Cleo would charm everyone with his nice smile, and the man couldn't understand where Cleo had gotten all his money at such a young age. Cleo frequently organized town festivals to win the favor of the townspeople and used some strange skills to seduce the young women. The man lamented that even his own fiancée, Emily, had fallen for Cleo, and he began to cry as he spoke about it. One of the adventurers present interjected, telling the man that just because a young, handsome, and wealthy individual was popular in town didn't mean he was using dark powers to gain that popularity. The adventurer suggested that Cleo sounded like a typical rich playboy and that the man was merely overthinking the situation, which made the man reconsider his perspective. The receptionist then stepped in, apologizing to the man and informing him that he could not accept the report. Instead, the receptionist advised him to pay the fee to personally hire an adventurer to deal with Cleo. At that moment, he showed the man the amount required to hire an adventurer, and the man was taken aback by the steep cost. At that moment, the man stormed out of the guild, declaring that they were all frauds and that they would regret their treatment of him. The adventurers began to chat among themselves, calling the man a fool and suggesting he needed to manage his jealousy. One adventurer speculated that the man had assumed everyone would jump into action simply because he mentioned necromancy, while another noted that there were far too many people like him these days. Karnak, looking troubled, turned to Baros and said they hadn't gained any useful information that day. Baros replied that he had heard there was a good restaurant nearby and suggested they go there to eat. Upon hearing this, Karnak told Baros that they should hurry to the restaurant. As they walked away, the receptionist mentioned that he would contact them if anything new came up. Outside the guild, Baros called out to Karnak, pointing out that the person mentioned earlier, Cleo, sounded suspicious, and Karnak agreed. Baros wondered why someone like Cleo, who was rich and handsome, would choose to operate in a small town instead of the city, which didn't make sense to either of them. Karnak then suggested that there was only one reason Cleo would target innocent country girls: he was after the souls of virgins. Karnak added that it must involve some kind of dark magic and insisted they should hurry to investigate the situation. Moments later, Karnak and Baros arrived in the town, and upon reaching their destination, Baros remarked that this must be the place and asked Karnak for his thoughts. Karnak activated his magic, and they soon noticed that the town was surrounded by a barrier that was exceptionally well crafted. He noted that even a high-ranked priest would struggle to detect this barrier, indicating that the person responsible for it was highly skilled. Karnak suggested they investigate to determine whether the creator of the barrier was involved with the darkness of the end, although he also acknowledged that the individual might simply be an ordinary necromancer. As he spoke to Baros, a man approached and called out to them. Karnak and Baros turned to see a priest coming toward them, surprised to find a priest in this area. The priest introduced himself as Alias, a rank 1 inquisitor of the Earth Order that serves Hadoba, and expressed his pleasure in meeting Karnak and Baros. They were taken aback to learn that he held the rank of 1, indicating he was a high-ranking priest. Baros then introduced Karnak as Baron Karnak of Jestard and mentioned that he himself was a family knight named Baros. Noticing that they were not adventurers, the priest asked them what brought them to this area. Karnak then spoke up, explaining to the priest that he had heard some strange rumors while passing through, and the two of them wanted to take a look around. The priest, excited by this, asked if they could do him a favor, emphasizing that it was for the goddess and nothing strange, expressing his enthusiasm. Baros inquired about the favor, and the priest explained that he was not yet certain, but there was a possibility that a necromancer was hiding in the town where he lived. Karnak was surprised to learn that the order had also heard about this, and both he and Baros began to panic. Karnak remarked that what the priest had mentioned was serious, and Baros asked the priest why he was alone if the situation was indeed dangerous. The priest explained that the order would not take action without concrete evidence, as they did not believe there was a necromancer in the town, given the prevalence of false information these days. Karnak noted that the situation was suspicious and emphasized that it was a matter of relative importance. The priest then added that in a countryside town like this one, it was not difficult to be considered rich and handsome compared to the city. A person could easily acquire such a reputation with just a little more money than others and by avoiding excessive tanning. This was why the priest was attempting to address the situation on his own. The priest glanced at Baros and noted that his sword and armor appeared fairly worn, and Baros had a well-trained physique. This led the priest to conclude that someone like Baros could not be weak. Excited by the realization that both Karnak and Baros seemed skilled, he expressed his confidence that they would be of great assistance to him. The priest added that with their presence, he would be able to cast his spells more effectively. Karnak and Baros, unsure of how to respond, found the situation frustrating but realized they had no choice but to accompany the priest, as they needed to investigate some matters themselves. The priest, filled with excitement, wondered why Karnak and Baros were just standing there, while Baros contemplated what might happen if he discovered that Karnak was also a necromancer. Karnak then thought to himself and mentioned to Baros that if that were to occur, he would simply use his magic to erase the priest's memories. Baros, upon hearing this, remarked that Karnak was quite evil and suggested they should avoid such a scenario, noting that he had yet to find anyone who remained sane after experiencing that magic. At that moment, Karnak changed his expression, shook the priest's hand, and assured him that, as children of the goddess, they would be willing to help. The priest, upon hearing that, was happy and thanked Karnak, wishing blessings from the goddess for him and Baros. He then informed them that he would take Karnak and Baros to the town church first. Moments later, the three of them arrived at the town church, where the head priest, Grotz, greeted them warmly and welcomed them to the Church of Wind. When they inquired about the supposed necromancer in the town, Grotz explained that Cleo had been of great help to the community and emphasized that he was completely unrelated to necromancy. Grotz further mentioned that another priest had stopped by earlier but had left shortly after, expressing disappointment that the three of them had traveled all the way to the town for nothing. The priest, upon hearing this, reassured Grotz that it was fine and considered it a good thing that they had come for nothing, as it meant no one was in danger. He felt relieved by Grotz's words. In response, Grotz agreed with the priest and mentioned that while he couldn't offer much, he encouraged them to make themselves comfortable during their stay in the town. He then offered to guide them to their rooms. Meanwhile, in a different location, a butler entered the room where Cleo was and informed him that a message had arrived from the town, adding that another person from the order had come to investigate. Cleo, upon hearing this, instructed the butler to report to him immediately if anything seemed amiss, to which the butler agreed. Holding a glass of wine, Cleo felt irritated by this information, thinking to himself that he was tired of these kinds of people continually coming to the town. Meanwhile, Grotz had shown the three to their respective rooms and wished them a good rest before leaving. After Grotz departed, Karnak turned to the priest and remarked that even the church members had very positive opinions of Cleo, suggesting that perhaps the entire town had been deceived by him. The priest, upon hearing Karnak's remark, agreed that it was true and added that interrogating others about Cleo would be pointless. He explained that they would need to meet Cleo directly. Surprised by the priest's intention to visit Cleo's mansion, Karnak asked if the priest planned to interrogate him. The priest replied that there was a much more effective method than that and assured Karnak and Baros that they simply needed to follow his plan. Moments later, night had fallen, and Cleo was preparing to go outside to meet his unexpected guests, Karnak, Baros, and the priest. As he walked through the hallway, a maid still working noticed him and asked where he was going that night. In response, Cleo cast an unknown spell on her and told her that he was on his way to meet some unwanted guests, assuring her that she need not worry and should instead go get some rest. The maid, hearing this, replied that she would see him again the next day and wished him a good night. As she walked away, Cleo smiled at her and thought to himself that he had not realized how effectively the charm spell could work. He was astounded by the fragility of the human mind. Cleo suddenly remembered that it had taken him nearly 6 months to prepare everything for the demon summoning, and he felt it was finally time for his efforts to bear fruit. However, just then, another obstacle had arisen. He was relieved that he had set up a detection barrier and decided he would simply talk to the intruders and send them on their way. As he approached, he discovered that the situation was not what he had anticipated. He found the three of them in the act of stealing his possessions. Cleo then demanded to know who they were and what they were doing. One of them, realizing they had been caught, asked Cleo if he was the rumored young master from the estate. Another thief informed Cleo that they had heard he was giving money to the townspeople and asked if he would be willing to share some with them as well. Cleo, observing them, thought to himself that they were indeed thieves and couldn't believe the situation. He realized he had worried for no reason. One of the thieves questioned why Cleo was laughing, while another suggested that they needed to teach him a lesson. Upon hearing that, Cleo became furious and declared that they were unworthy trash, incapable of becoming sacrifices. In a fit of rage, Cleo activated his magic and launched a powerful attack at them. However, just as the magic was about to hit, one of the thieves countered by activating his own magic and using a holy spell to block the attack. Cleo was shocked to see that the thieves could wield holy magic. At that moment, the three thieves revealed themselves, and it was none other than Karnak, Baros, and the priest. Baros remarked to Karnak and the priest that he hadn't expected Cleo to reveal his identity so easily. The priest responded that this method had already been proven effective and had never failed. Seeing the three, Cleo felt a wave of worry wash over him and regretted his earlier complacency. He realized he had no choice but to eliminate the three right then and there. With that, Cleo recited an incantation, commanding, "Awaken, my undead from the underworld and follow the darkness, and bear your vicious fangs," as he summoned an army of undead to confront them. The priest then informed Karnak and Baros that he would buy them some time using his authority. In that moment, Karnak and Baros charged at Cleo and his army of undead. As they fought, Baros easily dispatched the undead, and Karnak performed just as well. Cleo, witnessing this, felt a surge of worry and realized he had no other choice. He called upon a beast from the underworld, and a portal opened, revealing a demon knight. After summoning the demon knight, Cleo declared that they would not be able to handle such a formidable monster. However, just then, the priest invoked his holy magic, reciting an incantation that unleashed his spell, Holy Dispel, which sent all the undead and the demon knight back to their own realm. Cleo was shocked by the situation he found himself in and felt uncertain about how to proceed. Meanwhile, the priest informed Cleo that he already knew which spell Cleo intended to use. Furious at this revelation, Cleo acknowledged the three of them, stating that they were not merely insignificant pests. He decided it was time to reveal his true power. In that moment, Cleo activated his ability, transforming into a larger, beast-like monster. The priest was taken aback. He hadn't anticipated this and realized he was in trouble, as he didn't have enough time to summon another ally. Just as he was about to instruct Karnak and Baros to retreat, they charged toward Cleo without hesitation, delivering a powerful blow that incapacitated him instantly and without difficulty. The priest was surprised by the turn of events and struggled to comprehend what had just happened. As he observed Karnak and Baros, who appeared relaxed after facing a powerful foe, he realized that while their physical strength was ordinary, their skills and teamwork were remarkable. Lost in thought, the priest was interrupted by Baros, who asked whether they should kill Cleo or let him live. Still taken aback, the priest replied that he would handle Cleo. The priest then approached Cleo, who lay unconscious on the ground, and used his spell to extract all the dark energy from Cleo's body, collecting it in a bottle. He turned to Karnak and Baros, confirming that it was just as he had suspected, and explained that this was the darkness of the end. The priest then informed the two that all he needed to do now was clean up the mess. However, at that moment, Karnak approached and delivered a swift blow, knocking the priest unconscious. Afterward, Karnak told Baros that it was time for them to begin their own work. A short while later, after finishing his interrogation of the necromancer, Karnak turned to Baros and asked if he had found anything useful. Karnak replied that Cleo had always been a necromancer and had merely taken the opportunity to absorb some of the darkness of the end. Baros then added that the power Karnak had unleashed, which was absorbed by the necromancers, was undeniably tempting due to its great potential. He asked Karnak if there was anything else beyond what he had already mentioned. Karnak responded that it appeared Cleo was a cult member who revered Tezranik. Baros, confused by the name, inquired what Tezranik meant. Karnak explained that it seemed Tezranik was considered the god of death. Upon hearing this, Baros was surprised and remarked that he had thought it was Karnak who was regarded as that god of death. Baros mentioned that not just anyone could lay claim to a title like the one held by Karnak, to which Karnak replied that he wasn't entirely certain about it either. Karnak continued, explaining that, according to the cult's gospel, Tezranik was revered as the god of death and rebirth, an entity destined to cleanse the world through death and bring forth a new paradise. At that moment, Baros suggested that the cultists might be behind everything that had transpired. Karnak agreed and confirmed this was all the information they currently had. However, with a slight glimmer of satisfaction, Karnak told Baros there was one more thing he had learned, that with a priest's power, he could easily refine chaos mana. Hearing this, Baros asked if this was why Karnak wanted to accompany the priest to test it out. Karnak affirmed that Baros was correct. Karnak then explained that since chaos mana was purified and contained the power of sealed necromancy, he believed that, with the use of divinity, he could easily purify even more chaos mana. Hearing this, Baros now understood that Karnak's real motive was to experiment with divinity. Karnak went on to say that with this, his mana capacity would double, effectively elevating him to the level of a fourth circle magician. Baros, realizing the significance of this, remarked that they would need to keep an eye out for holy artifacts from that point onward. Karnak responded by suggesting they could always steal from a church later, but for now, he asked Baros to help him wake the priest. Baros agreed. Moments later, the priest, smiling cheerfully, told Karnak and Baros that he had let his guard down and hadn't expected to be caught in such a trap. He added that he was grateful to have them by his side. Karnak and Baros exchanged smiles, pleased to see that the priest was fully convinced by their act. Baros remarked to the priest that it seemed everything had ended well, although those affected by the necromancer's charm spell still appeared confused. The priest assured them that with the church assisting the townspeople, he was confident they would soon find peace. He then asked the two where they would be heading next. Karnak replied that he and Baros planned to rest in Durarth city for a while. Hearing this, the priest nodded and said it was time for them to part ways, wishing them the blessing of Hatoba on their journey. At that moment, Karnak and Baros bid farewell to the priest, advising him to be cautious on his journey back. However, after they departed, the priest found himself mulling over a lingering suspicion about the two. Although he couldn't pinpoint what seemed off, he realized that Karnak and Baros were not just ordinary travelers. Believing that uncovering their identities might benefit the castle, he resolved to investigate the matter as soon as he returned. Meanwhile, Karnak and Baros were pleased with how things had turned out. Karnak suggested they get some food, and Baros readily agreed. Later that evening, on the outskirts of Durarth city, the two had captured a necromancer and were subjecting him to intense interrogation. Bound upside down, the necromancer was repeatedly dunked in holy water as part of their relentless questioning. Tears streaming down his face, the necromancer pleaded with Karnak and Baros, promising to reveal everything he knew about the power of darkness and asking what they wanted to know. Instead of answering, Karnak instructed Baros to dunk him back into the holy water, and Baros complied. As they submerged the necromancer, they watched the dark energy seeping out of him. Karnak remarked that nothing purifies dark energy quite like holy water. Baros then asked if he should pour more, and Karnak agreed they should continue. When they were finally finished, Karnak and Baros walked through the city streets, satisfied with their success. Karnak noted that they had absorbed a great deal of the necromancer's power and commented that Hatoba was certainly favoring them, as things were going remarkably well. Baros told Karnak that he would contact the order to handle the aftermath, adding that they had apprehended quite a few necromancers that day. He mentioned his surprise when Alias, the priest, had sought their help, considering they had never met before. Karnak explained that it simply showed how desperate the church was for assistance. He added that the priest and church had likely conducted their own investigation after the Gelfa town incident. Karnak went on to say that any search into their past would reveal only that he had lost his family to necromancers, making him appear the least likely person to be hunting them for any ulterior motive. Karnak continued, saying that this situation actually worked to their advantage. The church would bring them important cases for free and supply them with valuable holy relics, leaving Karnak with no complaints. He noted that, in addition to these benefits, he and Baros had the freedom to handle things in their own way. Baros then told Karnak that it was about time for them to head back, but Karnak replied that it wasn't quite time yet. Puzzled, Baros asked if Karnak wasn't planning to gather every scattered piece. Karnak clarified that he had no intention of doing so. Instead, he explained, he would block the pathways through which the power spread. He had observed that the power flowed through temporal gates, so he intended to investigate the conditions for these gates to appear. To complete his research, Karnak needed to observe the powers of at least 20 more necromancers. Baros, realizing the scope of the task, remarked that it would take at least 3 more months for Karnak to finish. He speculated that perhaps some massive event was on the horizon. Just then, as Baros opened the door to their lodgings, a letter slipped onto the floor. Karnak picked up the letter, wondering if the Hatoba order had already reached out to them. However, as they read, they saw that it was from Alias, who requested a meeting with them and mentioned he would explain the situation in greater detail in person. Karnak, sensing the hint of a major event, remarked to Baros that something big seemed to be unfolding. The next day, at the Hatoba temple, Alias greeted Karnak and Baros warmly. In the room with him were two unfamiliar figures. Alias introduced them, asking Sarathi and Reltane if it was their first time meeting Karnak and Baros. Reltane stepped forward, introducing himself as a Sixth Circle mage. Sarathi followed, introducing herself as Sarathi Allen from the Adventurers Guild and stating that she was a swordsman. Hearing Sarathi and Reltane's introductions, Karnak and Baros began conversing through a telepathy spell. Karnak mentioned to Baros that Sarathi was an aura user who had awakened her martial energy at the age of 20 and was currently quite well known. Baros added that Reltane was also an advanced mage. Mages and martial energy users were ranked by levels based on their power. The more circles a mage possessed, the more advanced the spells they could wield. A grand mage at the 10th circle could even transcend the limits of humanity. At that moment, Karnak reflected that he had actually attained the skill level of a grand mage, though he was still limited by his lack of mana. An aura user awakened to martial energy was essentially the same, and knights were ranked into tiers: red, blue, purple, silver, and finally gold. The higher the rank, the purer and exponentially stronger their aura became. Among all these ranks, achieving the level of a gold knight was a feat only reached by the 4th martial king. Reltane, a 6th circle mage, and Sarathi, a red knight, would be sufficient as backup. Karnak then asked Baros if he had ever learned martial energy himself, to which Baros replied that he hadn't, though he had once fought the 4th martial king to a standstill without it. Shifting his focus to Reltane and Sarathi, Karnak told them he had heard much about their skills and was honored for him and Baros to meet them. Sarathi, however, quickly told Karnak that he didn't need to feel honored. Sarathi, with a bright expression, informed Karnak and Baros that they were the ones who had managed to capture so many necromancers in such a short amount of time. Karnak, however, was completely unaware of his own accomplishments and how they had come to learn about it. At that moment, Alias interrupted their conversation, stating that now that everyone had exchanged greetings, he would explain why he had gathered them, emphasizing that they didn't have much time. He instructed everyone to sit as he began his explanation. Alias then explained that, as they could see from their gathering, they were facing some troubles. He revealed that his order had recently encountered a problem in Trist City, which had been causing them difficulties ever since. Alias continued, explaining that Trist City was situated between the Kingdom of Ustil and the Kingdom of Tarlum, a location that had long been the source of disputes over land. Tired of the ongoing quarrels, the two kingdoms arranged a marriage between members of their nobility, thereby establishing the Count family of Trist to govern the now neutral territory. However, the city was ideally positioned for trade, yet it lacked the authority to effectively manage the growing wealth and population. This vacuum of power allowed crime syndicates to take control. As a result, Trist fell into ruin due to the rampant criminal activity, with the largest syndicates, the Ranfelts and the Plaths, expanding their influence unchecked. The two clans claimed the heritage of Trist's bloodline and split the city, but they had been locked in a struggle to determine the true successor. The kingdoms, troubled by the management of the city, agreed to recognize whichever side could govern effectively as the new count. Thus, the conflict between the Ranfelts and Plaths continued for decades, with the Plaths gaining the upper hand after the onset of the darkness of the apocalypse. The Plaths, involved in the slave trade, allied themselves with necromancers who shared similar ambitions. As they launched attacks against the Ranfelts, they attracted significant trouble. The Ranfelts, discovering the Plaths' collaboration with necromancers, reported this to Alias's order. The order acted swiftly upon confirming the use of necromancy. The conflict concluded with a victory for the Ranfelts, leaving the Plaths struggling to maintain their reputation. Karnak, upon hearing this, told Alias that it sounded like the conflict was resolved. However, Alias explained that the problem was that the Ranfelts were also being accused of using necromancy, but unlike the Plaths, they had hidden it well. Sarathi then stood up, asserting that both the Ranfelts and Plaths were the same, and she expressed her surprise that the order had not discovered this sooner. Alias responded that it was difficult to discern the tracks left by the darkness of the end. Sarathi, filled with fury, stated that the Ranfelts could easily deny their involvement, and she could not forgive them for that. Baros, looking worried, thought to himself that this situation sounded familiar to what he and Karnak were dealing with. Meanwhile, Karnak, equally enraged, stood up and declared that these creatures had abandoned their humanity, and he could not forgive them for their actions. Baros, hearing Karnak's words, reflected that Karnak truly had no shame. Baros then emphasized that the reputation of the Hatoba order was at stake, so their actions must be carried out discreetly. Alias agreed, noting that they needed to proceed with caution. He explained that any mistakes could complicate their efforts to catch the necromancers in the future. Alias then instructed everyone present to disguise themselves and infiltrate the city first. Someone in the group asked why he had not asked the members of his own order to handle the situation. Alias, looking serious, admitted that he was ashamed to say it, but there had been leaks of information within the order. He revealed that the previous group sent to the Ranfelts had vanished without a trace, and they had been skilled adventurers chosen by the order. Alias informed them that the order suspected Bishop Straff, a high-ranking priest who had aided the Ranfelts in driving out the Plaths, was behind the troubles. At that moment, Karnak asked Alias if he had informed the rest of the order about this plan. Alias replied that he had not shared any details with the order and was acting on his own authority, assuring them that he would report back once the matter was resolved. Then, Alias became serious and stressed the need for definite proof of necromancy being used. Sarathi, concerned, warned Alias that this could be dangerous and that the entire city might turn against them. In response, Alias explained that this was precisely why he had gathered everyone that day. He believed they would be capable of fending for themselves in the worst-case scenario. In a different area of the Ranfelt Manor's underground chamber, the sounds of men in pain echoed through the space. At that moment, a man in a black cloak spoke to his companion, noting that it had been a while since the order had sent anyone to investigate. He asked if it was time for the order to make a move again. The other companion, upon hearing this, replied that if that were the case, he would welcome them. He added that the order would merely be sending more sacrifices his way, his expression menacing as he spoke. This man was none other than Bishop Straff of the Hatoba Order's Trist Temple. At that moment, Straff unleashed his necromantic power on the bound men, observing their essence as it flowed from them. At that moment, Straff's companion remarked that he had observed a substantial amount of essence and asked Straff if he would be able to handle it. Straff unleashed his power in response and admitted that he would not be able to manage it. To protect himself, he invoked the grace of the great goddess, hoping that the order would send some formidable adventurers his way this time, allowing him to benefit more and grow stronger. A few moments later, Alias and his team arrived in Trist City. Upon observing the city, they noted its poor state. Alias remarked that with crime so rampant, it was not how things normally were. He also cautioned them to keep a close eye on their belongings. Just as he said this, a knife flew across the air and struck Relthane's bag, which was filled with money. As gold coins dropped from Relthane's bag, children began running up to collect the coins before darting away. Relthane, seeing this, became furious that the kids had stolen his money and was about to unleash his powers on them. However, Alias interjected, reminding everyone that in this place, it was every man for himself, which was why it was known as the City of Sin. Relthane then halted his magic and questioned how they could trust staying overnight at an inn in such a place. Alias reassured him that he knew of a suitable location for the night and instructed them to follow him. After a few moments, the rest of the group was taken aback by where Alias had led them. With a menacing smile, Alias revealed that they would be staying at the Plath's Manor for the night. Everyone was surprised by this decision, considering that Alias had previously brought down the Plath family, leading them to think that perhaps overworking had driven Alias to madness. Moments later, they were all inside the manor when a woman named Sildera, the head of the Plath household, addressed Alias and his team. She stated that she had no intention of making excuses and emphasized that anyone who had engaged in banned magic should face punishment, including her father. However, she added that the Ranfelts had also broken the law, and they could not allow them to escape consequences for their use of banned magic. Alias agreed with Sildera, asserting that they could not stand idly by while the Trist parish committed acts of violence. Karnak and Baros, upon hearing Alias's words, thought to themselves that he was a formidable man. he was skillfully redirecting the blame towards the Trist parish instead of himself and the Order. Alias then informed Sildera that they were in agreement on this matter and expressed his appreciation for her assistance in the operation against the Ranfelts. Sildera, upon hearing this, assured Alias that she would do her best to help and inquired about his plan for the situation. She explained that the Ranfelts had recently reinforced their security, making it nearly impossible to approach their mansion unless one had a high rank. Alias, with a broad smile, replied that this was precisely why he intended to ambush the Ranfelt residents. Everyone was taken aback by his suggestion, as it seemed overly simplistic. However, Alias confidently asserted that the plan was sure to succeed. Sildera then informed them that the Ranfelts did not possess a substantial military force at their estate, making their plan feasible. However, she expressed concern over their lack of information regarding the necromancers, worrying about their safety. Alias reassured Sildera that they would be fine, as his companions were seasoned veterans when it came to combating necromancers. As night fell over the Ranfelt estate, guards patrolled the grounds, ensuring security. Meanwhile, in a shadowy corner near the estate, 6 individuals clad in black and covered from head to toe stood ready. They were none other than Karnak and his team. Each of them held a Molotov cocktail in their hands. At that moment, Relthain declared that their actions were driven by a desire for revenge. With that, they all hurled their Molotov cocktails at the estate, shouting for the Ranfelts to experience the consequences of their actions. The guards were thrown into a state of panic, shouting to one another that they had been ambushed and requesting assistance to handle the attackers outside the walls. As the guards concentrated on the supposed ambushers, Karnak and his team took advantage of the chaos to sneak up behind them, using the Molotov cocktails as a distraction. While they were making their way forward, Karnak remarked to the others that the Molotovs had proven to be quite effective for diverting attention. Alias then urged them to seize the opportunity to enter the estate, as he could sense the foul stench of necromancy emanating from the mansion. However, just then, the guards spotted them and stood in front of Karnak and his team. Relthain, unfazed, declared that it was time to greet the guards with a taste of his magic. In an instant, he unleashed a fireball and followed it up with a chain lightning spell, swiftly incapacitating most of the guards with ease. The guards were taken aback by how quickly Relthain cast his spells. One of the guards urged the others to remain calm, reminding them that there were only 5 ambushers in front of them. However, at that moment, Sarathy stepped forward, her sword drawn. She activated her battle aura and launched into a furious rampage, cutting down anyone who stood in her way. Baros, observing her, remarked to Karnak that this was not the intended use of a battle or a sword, adding that Sarathy's movements were disappointing. Karnak shot back that it was ironic coming from Baros, who lacked battle aura altogether. Meanwhile, Karnak and Baros joined the fray, easily dispatching the guards who charged at them. In the midst of the chaos, the priest was consumed by fury, swinging his sword in anger at the guards and demanding their surrender. Baros and Karnak exchanged glances, both wondering when the priest had learned to wield a sword with such skill. After a few moments, the guards began to fall back, prompting Alias to remark that this seemed to signal the end of the fight. However, Sarathy questioned why the necromancers had not yet appeared. Alias speculated that the necromancers were likely waiting for them inside the building, where it would be more advantageous to fight. As they entered the estate, they found the interior surprisingly quiet. Suddenly, 3 necromancers emerged in front of them. One of the necromancers spoke, acknowledging that Karnak and his team had made it inside. He pointed out their impressive credentials, noting that they included an aura user and a high-ranked mage, both of whom were quite famous. Nevertheless, he dismissed their reputation, claiming it was meaningless in the face of the dark power they wielded. Behind the necromancers loomed a high-ranked undead specter, ready for battle. Karnak and his team felt a surge of excitement upon seeing the undead specter, as they had finally found the evidence they needed to prove that the Ranfelts were employing necromancers in their conflict against the Plaths. Sarathy remarked that all they needed to do was capture the necromancers and bring them back, which would complete their mission. Alias agreed, noting that this evidence should suffice for their purposes. Meanwhile, Karnak and Baros exchanged menacing laughs, fully aware that capturing the 3 necromancers would be highly profitable for them. The necromancers, infuriated by the audacity of Karnak and his team, warned them that their laughter would not last long once they were finished with them. At that moment, the necromancers unleashed the undead specter to confront Karnak and his team. However, Alias intervened, proclaiming that the light of the goddess would punish all that was impure. In an instant, the specter's powers weakened, leaving the necromancers in shock as they realized Alias was a priest. Seizing the opportunity, Sarathi delivered a powerful strike, instantly eliminating the undead specter. But she didn't stop there. She charged at the necromancers, ready to engage them. Just as she was about to attack, the heads of all three necromancers suddenly exploded, taken down by an unseen force. Alias shouted at Sarathi, reminding her that their objective was to capture the necromancers, not to eliminate them. Sarathi, equally surprised, insisted that she had not been the one to eliminate them. Alias, puzzled by the unfolding events, observed the mansion transforming before his eyes and wondered how this was possible. At that moment, Karnak and the team heard a voice announcing that this would be a splendid harvest, as among them were an aura user, a sixth circle mage, and even Inquisitor Alias, perfect sacrifices for him. Recognizing the voice, Alias concluded that the man behind this was none other than Bishop Straff of the Trist Parish. With a menacing smile, Straff questioned Alias about his arrival, suggesting that Alias had suspected him from the beginning. Alias, taken aback, expressed his disbelief that a servant of the goddess could be tempted by the power of darkness, realizing that he had been mistaken in his assumptions. Sarathi and Reltane informed Alias that the exit had been blocked and that they were unable to destroy the wall. In response, Alias explained that their powers were weakened by the dark energy surrounding them. He attempted to eliminate this dark energy, but to his surprise, his powers were ineffective. Karnak was astonished to realize that Alias's divine power was actually amplifying the necromantic energy. Straff then revealed that the individuals they had encountered moments earlier were not genuine necromancers. He added that if that were all there was to necromancy, the seven orders would not be so concerned about the dark. With a mocking tone, Straff asked Alias how it felt to finally meet a true necromancer like himself. Alias felt a mix of trouble and fury, realizing he was powerless to change the situation. At that moment, Karnak used telepathy to tell Baros to get ready, cautioning that if they were unlucky, this could be their grave. Baros was taken aback by Karnak's words. Karnak explained that the barrier was a mix of divine and necromantic power, something he had never encountered before. He realized there was nothing he could do against it without resorting to his necromantic abilities and chaos mana. However, using these powers would expose him, revealing his identity as a necromancer. Baros was surprised that Karnak didn't know the spell for the barrier and was equally astonished that a seemingly insignificant priest like Straff could create such a formidable obstacle while Karnak struggled to comprehend it. At that moment, Straff warned the team there was nowhere to run, and from the ground emerged chaotic golems, puppets of the necromancer. One of the golems launched an attack on the team, but Alias swiftly called upon his divine power, casting a protective shield to defend them. However, Alias's shield could only hold for so long. He was not at full strength and warned his team that he wouldn't be able to maintain it much longer. Reltane urged Alias to hold on a bit longer, promising he would handle the situation. But just as Reltane was preparing to cast his spell, the barrier shattered under the force of the golem's assault, sending both Alias and Reltane flying backward and leaving them unconscious. The golems had now captured Alias and Reltane, prompting Straff to order them to lock the two in the basement with the other offerings. Just then, Sarathi arrived, delivering a powerful strike to one of the golems. However, the attack barely left a mark, weakened as Sarathi's powers were. Shocked that her assault did nothing, Sarathi found herself caught in the golem's grasp. Straff then ordered the golem to imprison her in the basement as well, alongside the other sacrifices, but added that Karnak and Baros were useless and should simply be eliminated. Karnak and Baros exchanged glances, stunned that they were being dismissed as irrelevant. As one of the golems restrained Sarathi, Baros stepped in and struck, shattering the golem's hand that held her. He reminded Sarathi that he had warned her to be cautious. With that, Baros charged at the golem, swiftly finishing it off with his sword. Sarathi, taken aback, asked how he had defeated the golem so easily without using any aura. Baros considered the answer silently, knowing that chaotic golems had weak points in areas where mana did not flow. However, because the mana constantly shifted, Pinpointing these vulnerabilities required skill and experience, both of which he possessed. As he assessed the situation, Baros felt a pang of guilt for leaving Sarathi to fend for herself, but he knew that conserving his stamina was crucial. If he exhausted himself, they would both be in grave danger. Baros thought that Karnak would soon join the fight. Meanwhile, Karnak assessed the worsening situation, realizing that his necromancy wasn't working. Even if he infused the fog with his own necromantic power, he still couldn't control it. Convinced they were on the brink of defeat, Karnak knew he had to find a solution. He doubted there were necromancy spells he didn't know about, so he suspected there must be another factor at play. Since all his previous efforts had failed, Karnak decided there was only one remaining theory to test, and he resolved to put it into action. Baros and Karnak were dismantling the golems with ease, and Straff watched in fury, unable to believe that his chaotic golems were being destroyed so effortlessly. He reminded himself not to underestimate Karnak and Baros. Straff wondered if he should have absorbed the necromantic powers sealed by the Hadoba order, realizing that the golems alone would not be enough to stop the two. Just then, an undead specter charged directly at Sarathi. She tried to escape, but the specter quickly caught up. When she attempted a counterattack, her strike passed through it harmlessly. The specter retaliated, landing a powerful blow on Sarathi's hand. She screamed in pain, her hands rendered useless from the attack. The specter seized the injured Sarathi, but Karnak's voice cut through the chaos as he called out to Straff, labeling him an amateur necromancer and declaring that this was enough. Karnak grinned, having figured out how to break the barrier Straff had cast. Startled, Straff watched in confusion as his barrier began to collapse and demanded to know what Karnak had done. Karnak replied with a smirk, explaining that he had simply overlaid his own barrier on top of Straff's. He told Straff to stop acting high and mighty, given his amateur skills. But instead of being insulted, Straff merely smiled at Karnak's taunt. Straff declared that he was no amateur, and in that instant, he called upon the dead of the underworld. Hundreds of undead rose from the ground and charged toward Karnak and Baros. Baros asked Karnak how Straff could summon the undead if the barrier was under Karnak's control. Karnak explained that the barrier had fallen, and he could do little against necromancy of this magnitude. He told Baros they would have to confront Straff directly and urged him to prepare for battle. Baros noted that the undead appeared to be high-ranking, far beyond basic necromancy. As they fought, he remarked to Karnak that Straff seemed to possess far greater necromantic power than they had anticipated and that, at this rate, the battle could drag on indefinitely. As they fought against the undead, Karnak told Baros that the longer the battle dragged on, the worse their chances would become, suggesting they make a break for it at the first opportunity. Karnak then cast his Dark Blade spell, pushing the undead back and creating some distance between himself, Baros, and the approaching horde. Straff, watching this, remarked that Karnak wasn't bad but insisted it was useless against his overwhelming power. With a sinister grin, Straff summoned yet another entity, the Demon of Gehenna. The demon emerged and asked his summoner, Straff, to state his desires. Laughing menacingly, Straff commanded the demon to eliminate the two men and the woman. However, the demon paused, asking who he was supposed to kill, as he could see no one in front of him. Straff was stunned upon hearing the demon's confusion, wondering why it couldn't see Karnak, Baros, or Sarathi. Karnak then mocked Straff, remarking that he had never seen a necromancer fall for an illusion so easily. Straff, shocked that Karnak had cast an illusion without his notice, listened as Karnak pointed out that with Straff's barrier broken, it was clear he was just an amateur. With that, Karnak bid Straff farewell. Realizing it had all been an illusion, Straff seethed with rage, vowing they would pay for humiliating him. A short while later, outside the estate, Karnak and Baros sat on the ground catching their breath. Karnak chuckled, calling Straff a fool for falling for the illusion, adding that this was the price for relying solely on one type of magic. Baros agreed, noting that Straff's oversight had bought them just enough time to make their escape. Baros then warned Karnak that returning to the Platts would be dangerous, and Karnak agreed, noting that the Ranfelts would likely search for them there first. As they spoke, Sarathi, bruised and battered, interrupted them, accusing them of lying to her and the others all along. Both Karnak and Baros were taken aback by her accusation, and Karnak asked how she felt now that she was awake. Annoyed, Sarathi shot back, telling Karnak not to pretend to care for her since they were necromancers. She then asked where they were, and Karnak explained that they were hiding outside the city to avoid detection, needing time to help Sarathi heal from her serious injuries. Sarathi was taken aback when Karnak said he would heal her instead of eliminating her. Noticing her surprise, Karnak explained that he and Baros were trying to be good people. He added that he could erase some of her memories so she wouldn't remember he was a necromancer. However, Sarathi told Karnak it was unnecessary. She could hardly feel her arms after the attack from the undead specter and realized she wouldn't be able to live a normal life, let alone become a necromancer. In that moment, she urged Karnak to just eliminate her. Baros, feeling sympathy for Sarathi, suggested to Karnak that they could try using a healing spell from a skilled priest. But Karnak shook his head, stating that using holy water would go against the natural order. Baros then asked Karnak if, given that, there was anything they could do with necromancy to help her. Karnak was about to respond when Sarathi interrupted, asking if he could use necromancy to restore her arms. Karnak replied that he might be able to, but he cautioned her against it, explaining that accepting necromancy would require her to become his servant. He looked at Sarathi seriously and asked if she was willing to serve an evil necromancer like himself. The thought of becoming a necromancer's servant terrified Sarathi. She knew that necromancers controlled human souls, binding them through slave contracts, and she had heard countless stories of captured adventurers enduring cruel torture before meeting their tragic ends. Sarathi found the thought of becoming a servant terrifying, but as she looked at her now unusable hands, she began to reconsider the offer. Meanwhile, Baros and Karnak communicated through telepathy, and Baros accused Karnak of being a bastard for mentioning the condition so deliberately. Karnak replied that he had no choice, as he understood how Sarathi felt and hoped he wasn't asking too much of her. Karnak then turned his attention back to Sarathi, explaining that while he preferred to avoid using necromancy, her current state left him unable to suggest alternatives. He added that if Sarathi chose to become his servant, she would regain her lost arm. He urged her to decide, assuring her that he would respect whatever choice she made. Sarathi then asked Karnak what would happen if she became his servant. Karnak explained that once the contract was sealed, he would be able to see the structure of her soul, which would allow him to restore her body. While Sarathi would retain her free will, certain restrictions would apply. If she were to betray Karnak, it would lead to her death. As Sarathi contemplated this, she realized it might sound dangerous at first, but it was not entirely different from the vow of loyalty that knights took. Karnak then added that Sarathi needed to decide whether she wanted to lose her freedom or forfeit her future as a swordsman, emphasizing that the decision was entirely hers. After careful consideration, Sarathi addressed Karnak as her lord and requested that he accept her as his servant. Karnak then told Sarathi that this would be the last time he would ask her, repeating his question about her certainty regarding the decision. Sarathi replied that this choice was better than never being able to wield a sword again. Hearing her resolve, Karnak informed her that it was time to initiate the contract. He placed his hand in front of Sarathi's forehead and declared that in the name of Karnak Jestard, Lord of Darkness, he requested that Sarathi Alan become his servant. Sarathi responded affirmatively, saying yes. Karnak continued, instructing her to open her mind and accept the contract of servitude, assuring her that if she did, she would regain what she had lost. At that moment, a purple light emanated from Karnak's hand, flowing into Sarathi's body and then into her injured hands. As the light enveloped her, Sarathi's injuries began to fade away. Karnak then informed Sarathi that she was now officially his servant, and she responded with a bright smile, referring to him as her master. Baros congratulated Sarathi on becoming Karnak's servant and on the healing of her hand. He then shifted the conversation, asking what they planned to do about the kidnapped Aliasen. Reltane. Karnak acknowledged that Straff's necromantic powers were stronger than he had anticipated, suggesting that it would be wiser to use large-scale necromancy rather than chaos mana. Baros cautioned Karnak that employing such a method would risk destroying the city. In response, Karnak outlined their two options. They could prepare to save Alias and Reltane, or they could abandon them and flee. Upon hearing this, Baros told Karnak that either choice they made would reflect poorly on them, adding that being good was difficult for them. Karnak agreed with Baros's assessment. Sarathi, puzzled by their struggle to decide, expressed her belief that saving their friends was the obvious choice. However, Baros responded that pursuing that option would require violent methods, which could lead to the destruction of the city. Sarathi countered that, while it might not be the best choice, they could not abandon their friends. She insisted that saving them, despite the potential danger, was the right thing to do. Karnak and Baros then acknowledged Sarathi's perspective, realizing that as long as their intent was good, even using evil methods to achieve that intent could be justified. Sarathi was taken aback by Baros's comments, but at that moment, Karnak interjected, stating that he had no choice but to resort to necromancy. Baros reassured her, explaining that it would be acceptable since Sarathi had justified using evil methods to save their friends. However, Sarathi was surprised by their interpretation of her words, as she hadn't anticipated they would view it in that light. Meanwhile, the Ranfelts had entered Plath's territory, actively searching for Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi. They ordered the locals to open their doors or report if they had seen 3 suspicious individuals in the area. One of the Ranfelts members apprehended all outsiders who didn't belong to the Plath territory. When one outsider questioned what they were doing to him, insisting he was just passing through, the Ranfelts refused to release him. At that moment, one of the men from the Ranfelts territory looked troubled. He was tired and reluctant to be working in the middle of the night. Another companion noticed his attitude and ordered him to get back to work. This led to an argument between them, escalating until one man attacked the other. A green light burst from his sword as he struck, hitting the other man. Infuriated by the blow, the injured man retaliated, swinging his sword and fatally wounding his companion. As other members of the Ranfelts arrived to investigate the commotion, the attacker claimed it was his companion's fault. However, when they turned to face him, their expressions changed to shock as they realized he had transformed into a monstrous figure. Panic spread among them, and they charged at him. The man, taken aback by their reaction, found himself powerless to defend against their onslaught and was swiftly eliminated on the spot. At that moment, in the distance, Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi watched the chaos unfolding below them. Karnak remarked that the city was corrupt, noting how quickly everyone fell into a panic whenever an issue arose. This made it easy for him to manipulate them into turning on each other. Sarathi, surprised by this tactic, asked Karnak why he had to create such a scene. Karnak explained that his goal was to build an army of undead. Sarathi was taken aback by the idea of summoning an army right there, but Karnak assured her that it was the best option to confront Straff. He pointed out that there was enough death energy in the city, and he intended to harness it to its fullest potential. However, Karnak informed Sarathi that there weren't enough bodies to control, leaving him with no choice but to create more. Baros chimed in, acknowledging that their actions might seem a bit evil, but emphasized that they were doing it all for the sake of their friends, so they had no alternative. Both Karnak and Baros smiled menacingly as they spoke. Sarathi contemplated whether what they were doing was justified. She realized that if she hadn't suggested her idea, Karnak and Baros might have abandoned Alias and Reltane. Despite her initial misgivings, Sarathi thought that Karnak didn't seem as evil as she had first believed. He was only targeting members of the Ranfelts while leaving the ordinary townspeople unharmed. The Ranfelts members were engaged in a brutal fight against one another, and slowly the trust among them began to disintegrate as they killed each other. While the Ranfelts struggled with their own, Karnak and Baros watched the chaos from a distance, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Karnak remarked that this turmoil would be more than enough to level the playing field against Straff. With that, he summoned his necromancy on the fallen, transforming them into his undead army. As he unleashed his powers, the dead began to rise slowly. Sarathi, witnessing this, once again reconsidered her perception of Karnak. She realized she should forget about any notions of his kindness, as what he was doing in that moment was undeniably cruel and evil. At that moment, Karnak commanded his undead, and they began marching toward the Ranfelts estate where Straff awaited. Sarathi contemplated whether she would be fine after becoming Karnak's servant. Moments later, they arrived at the Ranfelts estate, and Karnak's undead clashed with the beings summoned by Straff. As Karnak observed the battle, he noted that while everything seemed to be going according to plan, Straff's necromancy was more powerful than he had anticipated. Straff had managed to summon a death dragon and 7 trumpeters. Karnak reflected that he should have been the only one capable of wielding such a spell. However, with the changes in the past, he wondered if others had somehow gained access to his artifacts. Karnak then urged the others to move quickly or risk being discovered. Sarathi, confused, asked what he meant. Karnak explained that Straff would soon realize the zombies were merely illusions. Surprised by this revelation, Sarathi listened as Karnak clarified that most of the zombies were indeed illusions. He also mentioned that it was impossible for him to create such a large number of undead in a short period because there were too few people available for him to turn. Upon hearing this, Sarathi re-evaluated her opinion of Karnak, believing him to be a good person who didn't want to kill more individuals. However, this perception was far from the truth. Karnak's inability to create more undead stemmed from the lack of available bodies around him, a fact that Sarathi was unaware of. Inside the estate, Straff was preparing a ritual to sacrifice Alias and Reltane, aiming to enhance his power further. At that moment, he used the eyes of his summoned creatures to locate Karnak and the others hiding nearby. Although he spotted many zombies, he dismissed them as mere pests, unconcerned about their numbers. As Straff continued his search, a voice called out to him, commenting on the size of the basement and expressing surprise at the hidden features of the estate. Recognizing the familiar voice, Straff turned around, only to find Karnak stepping forward. Karnak informed Straff that he had mentioned they would meet again, and Straff was taken aback to realize that Karnak and his team had successfully infiltrated his sanctuary. Karnak then told Straff that he seemed quite tired, likely from fighting the zombies, which had taken a toll on him. Sarathi noticed Alias and Reltane lying on the floor, bound and helpless. Upon closer inspection, she saw an altar prepared for their sacrifice to the demon, but fortunately, they had not yet been offered. Realizing he had fallen into their trap, Straff became furious. He declared that despite his exhaustion, it was not enough to prevent him from facing them. He insisted that they would regret their decision to intrude upon his domain. At that moment, Straff ordered his undead to charge and confront Karnak and the others, but it proved ineffective as Baros and Sarathi easily dispatched the undead. Karnak joined the fight, summoning the souls from the depths of purgatory to assist Baros and Sarathi. Within moments, they managed to eliminate all of Straff's undead. Surprised by their swift victory, Straff declared that he would now use his trump card and summon the demon Gehennas. Sarathi felt a twinge of worry at the sight of the demon, while Baros sarcastically asked Straff if he was not tired of summoning the same demon repeatedly. Karnak chimed in, noting that this had become rather repetitive. Karnak thought to himself that Straff's necromancy power must have reached its limits by then. In that moment, he cast a spell on the demon, surprising both the demon and Straff. Karnak explained that the spell he had used on the demon was called a counter-summoning, bidding farewell to the demon as it was about to be sent back to its own realm. However, the demon refused to give up easily. It declared to Karnak that it would tear his spell to shreds. Using its brute force, the demon managed to break free from the spell. The demon then turned to Straff, asking who his contractor was and what order it should follow. With a smile, Straff commanded the demon to eliminate Karnak and Baros while instructing it to bring Sarathi to him. The demon informed Straff that it would fulfill his order and, in that moment, unleashed its power, catching Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi by surprise. Sarathi noted the incredible pressure the demon exuded, while Karnak was astonished that the demon had managed to break free from the counter-summoning spell he had cast. Realizing that things had not gone as he had expected, Karnak instructed the two to engage the demon for the time being, leaving Baros and Sarathi shocked by his command. Both Baros and Sarathi launched powerful attacks at the demon, but their efforts proved futile against its overwhelming strength. With a mere flick, the demon sent them both staggering backward. Karnak then conjured a fireball spell and hurled it at the demon, but the demon swiftly cast a barrier, successfully blocking the attack. Sarathi then informed Karnak that if the demon was an aura user, it would likely be at the level of a purple knight. Baros, upon hearing this, expressed regret that if only he had awakened his battle power, he wouldn't be struggling like this. At that moment, Karnak had a sudden idea and told Baros that they would proceed with Plan B. Both Baros and Sarathi were taken aback, unaware that there was a Plan B. Karnak then placed his hand on Baros's head and instructed him to open his mind and accept it. As Baros complied, His eyes opened wide, and the spell known as possession activated, allowing Baros to inhabit Sarathi's body. Baros then informed the others that it had been a while since he had moved into someone else's body. Sarathi was taken aback to realize that Baros had possessed her body, and at that moment, Karnak ordered Baros to attack the demon. As Baros charged forward, he apologized to Sarathi for borrowing her body, but she urged him to treat it well and promised to give it back. The demon laughed, questioning how someone like Baros, who wasn't an aura user, could possibly wield another's battle aura. In response, Baros asked the demon who had said he couldn't use aura, and then he slashed his sword at the demon, landing a powerful blow. The demon was taken aback by the damage Baros had inflicted, and Baros, noticing the demon's surprise, declared that his expertise was in using someone else's aura. The demon was stunned to see Baros exploit its vulnerabilities with such precision. What shocked it even more was Baros's newfound strength, far surpassing what it had faced before. The demon realized this battle would not be easily won. Baros's sword radiated a brilliant blue aura, and Sarathi, astonished, noticed the same aura emanating from her own blade. In that moment, she understood that she had become a Blue Knight, a transformation triggered by Baros taking control of her body. Baros acknowledged her latent power, remarking that it allowed him to fight with greater ease. Without hesitation, he unleashed a devastating attack on the demon, injuring it severely. The demon, reeling from the blow, struggled to accept that it was losing the fight. Baros, exuding confidence, smiled as he questioned whether the demon had already exhausted its strength. Enraged by his taunt, the demon retaliated sharply, declaring that Baros should not assume victory simply because he had attained the ability to wield aura. The demon then unleashed a powerful attack aimed at Karnak, warning Baros that once he ceased his possession, both he and the rest of his allies would be finished. The attack struck Karnak with a thunderous explosion, and the demon erupted into menacing laughter, convinced that it had finally secured victory. However, amidst the chaos, Karnak remained unscathed, smiling as he calmly addressed the demon. He remarked on how easily the demon and Straff had been deceived. In an instant, hundreds of Karnak's illusions materialized, encircling the demon, who was left stunned by the unexpected sight. Karnak calmly stated that he could already anticipate the demon's actions and thoughts. The demon, now overwhelmed, hesitated, unable to discern which of the illusions was the real Karnak. Realizing the peril it faced, the demon's mind raced, searching for a solution. In that moment of distraction, Baros struck from behind with a devastating blow, inflicting severe damage that nearly annihilated the demon. Reeling from the attack, the demon reflected on its predicament. It had overexerted itself, breaking free from the counter-summon, leaving it with insufficient mana. The thought of being so grievously wounded by a mere human was almost unthinkable. Desperate to survive, the demon summoned a gate, intending to escape from Karnak and the others before it was too late. Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi noticed the reappearance of the summoning gate. The demon, turning toward them, declared its intent to leave for the time being but promised that upon its return, it would seek them out first. It vowed to ensure they would neither live nor die, condemning them to an existence of torment and misery. Karnak, seething with anger at the demon's attempt to flee after all it had done, resolved not to let it escape so easily. Channeling his necromantic powers, Karnak unleashed a powerful spell that struck the demon. The magic began to drain the demon's mana, and though the demon fought back desperately, its efforts were futile. With its energy completely depleted, the demon was finally destroyed. As the battle ended, Baros returned to his original body and expressed his gratitude to Sarathi for allowing him to possess hers. Sarathi, however, winced in pain as the effects of the possession faded, leaving her momentarily weakened. Baros, noticing Sarathi's discomfort, advised her to release her mana to ease the pain. Karnak then turned to the two and reminded them that one more enemy remained to be dealt with. Before they could act, Straff raised his hand and announced his surrender. He offered to provide Karnak with any information he wanted, asking what Karnak wished to know. Karnak, however, dismissed the offer, explaining that Straff was misunderstanding the situation. Confused, Straff asked what Karnak meant. Karnak calmly replied that it would be far simpler to kill him and summon his soul for interrogation, avoiding unnecessary complications. Turning to Sarathi, Karnak asked if there was any reason to spare Straff. Without hesitation, Sarathi replied that there was no reason for him to hesitate. With her support, Karnak unleashed his necromantic powers, swiftly ending Straff's life. After finishing their work, Karnak informed Baros and Sarathi that it was time for him to attend to his personal matters. He proceeded to absorb all the necromantic power lingering within Straff, feeling satisfied with the substantial energy he had gained. Baros, observing this, remarked to Karnak that they could now head home. Karnak and Baros exchanged pleased smiles, with Karnak agreeing that they had accomplished enough and suggesting they should make their way back. Baros nodded in agreement and added that he would check if there were any good restaurants along the route. Before they could leave, Sarathi interrupted, reminding them not to abandon Alias and Reltane, who were still lying unconscious on the ground. She insisted they help their fallen allies before departing. Karnak suddenly remembered Alias and Reltane, admitting he had completely forgotten about them. Moments later, both Alias and Reltane regained consciousness. They were astonished to learn that Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi had managed to defeat Straff on their own. Reltane, still in disbelief, remarked that Straff was not someone who could be overcome by just 3 people. Karnak explained that they had been fortunate. He recounted how, after Alias and Reltane were injured by the golems and dragged into the basement, an unexpected army of zombies attacked the residence. It appeared that another necromancer had taken advantage of the chaos to stage a revolt. Straff, preoccupied with suppressing the uprising and battling the other necromancers, had depleted much of his necromantic power. Weakened, Straff had retreated to the basement, where they ultimately confronted him. Karnak explained to Alias and Reltane that they had seized the opportunity to defeat Straff with Sarathi's help while the 2 of them were unconscious. Alias, listening to the account, admitted he had little to say except that it might have been Hodoba's blessing at work. He added that he was once again indebted to Karnak for his efforts. Karnak reassured Alias that they had not disturbed the corpse, allowing him to perform the purification ritual. When Alias activated his purification powers, he was astonished by the immense amount of darkness he extracted. He remarked that Straff possessed at least 10 times the amount of darkness compared to other necromancers, a truly overwhelming concentration of the darkness of the end. Baros, using telepathy, asked Karnak why a significant amount of necromantic power still lingered in Straff. He had assumed Karnak had absorbed everything, including the information extracted from Straff. Karnak explained that taking everything would have been too conspicuous, so he intentionally left a large portion of the power behind to avoid drawing suspicion. Alias then informed the group that their work there was complete. With Straff defeated, the Ranfelts had lost their cohesion, and the city would soon stabilize. He added that they could now leave the remaining tasks to the Order. As the sun began to rise, Alias was surprised to learn that Sarathi had become a knight of the Gestard barony. Curious, he asked her about her reasons for accepting such a position. Sarathi explained to Alias that her decision came from the realization that Baron Karnak was someone worthy of her allegiance. She tried to laugh it off, but Karnak noticed that her words didn't truly reflect her feelings. Alias acknowledged her reasoning and remarked that finding someone to serve was a positive step for her. Karnak then mentioned his intention to return to his territory to officially ordain her as a knight, indicating that this marked their departure. He expressed his gratitude to Alias for his cooperation and added that they would meet again when the opportunity arose. A short while later, Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi arrived at their territory. The butler and maids, standing outside the mansion, were overjoyed to see Karnak's return. They greeted him warmly with bright smiles, their excitement evident as they welcomed him home. Karnak, upon seeing the butler and maids, greeted them warmly and remarked that it was nice to see them again. The head butler was about to ask if they had been well during his absence when his gaze shifted to the woman standing behind Karnak. His excitement grew as he noticed the beautiful woman next to him, and the others shared his enthusiasm, speculating that she might be Karnak's lover. Before the excitement could escalate, Karnak interrupted the butler and maids, assuring them that he would make an introduction. He then introduced the woman, saying her name was Sarathi Allen, and from that point on, she would be the new knight of the Gestard barony. Sarathi, now the center of attention, politely addressed them, expressing that it was a pleasure to meet all of them. The butlers and maids were taken aback upon hearing that Sarathi was a knight. The head butler, concerned, pointed out to Karnak that even though their territory was currently unstable, they couldn't just accept anyone as a knight, as it could cause complications. At that moment, Baros called out to Sarathi, urging her to demonstrate her powers. Without hesitation, Sarathi drew her sword and released her battle aura, stunning everyone with the revelation that she was an aura user. To further prove her strength, Sarathi unleashed her full battle aura and, with a single strike, cleaved a tree in half. With a smile, Sarathi turned to the butler and expressed her eagerness to get to know everyone. Meanwhile, the head butler, still in awe of her abilities, wondered privately what such a valuable person was doing in a place like this. A few weeks later, Sarathi was training with the Jestard Knights. During a break, 2 knights were observing her and discussing her impressive skills. One knight commented that the person who had been sparring against Sarathi was struggling immensely. The other knight agreed, sharing that he understood how it felt. He added that the difference in Sarathi's weight, combined with her sheer strength, made it difficult for him to comprehend how he was being pushed back even when she wasn't using her battle aura. He concluded that aura users were truly remarkable. After training concluded for the day, Baros approached Sarathi and expressed his gratitude for her efforts in training the knights. He then asked if she would be willing to spar with him as well. As Baros and Sarathi sparred, Baros pointed out that her use of battle aura was still clumsy, and she was wasting her power unnecessarily. He advised her to focus on using the right amount of power with each strike. Sarathi, struggling to grasp the concept, thought to herself that it wasn't as easy as it sounded. She then asked Baros if he could possess her body again, just as he had done before. She believed that by experiencing the power a few more times, she would get a better feel for it and eventually be able to use it on her own. Baros, however, cautioned against doing it again. He explained that while possessing her once more might be acceptable, doing so more than 3 times would corrupt her soul and drive her insane. Sarathi was shocked by his words, realizing the danger of such actions. Baros reassured her that she was talented enough to grow stronger without the need for possession. Sarathi was still processing what Baros had told her about possession when he interrupted her, reminding her that she needed to assist him in awakening his battle aura later in the afternoon. He suggested they end their sparring session for the time being. Meanwhile, in his office, Karnak was deep in thought, trying to figure out how Straff had managed to combine necromantic power with divinity. He wondered if there was some kind of ability that allowed one to merge their power with another form of energy. As he pondered this, a sharp pain began to throb in his head, signaling his frustration with the lack of answers. Realizing he couldn't make sense of it at the moment, Karnak decided to set aside his thoughts on this matter. He knew that for now, he needed to focus on sealing the hole that was spreading darkness. Karnak realized that the darkness of the end flowed through time and space, spreading across the land. He understood that he needed to create a powerful physique capable of investigating dangerous aspects of time and space, allowing him to control the darkness in detail without making any mistakes. As he activated his power, Karnak successfully completed the creation of his time-space investigation physique and perfected the end of darkness. Later that night, Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi were gathered in the forest of Deventer territory, which bordered Jestard territory. Karnak looked at Baros and asked why he hadn't yet awakened his battle aura, despite once being the world's greatest martial artist. Baros then told Karnak that this was before his regression, adding that he missed the time when Karnak was the Death King. Back then, things had been easier, as Karnak would simply give Baros the dark battle aura. As the two conversed, Sarathi couldn't help but reflect on what she had just heard. She was surprised to realize that everything seemed to stem from these two people sitting across from her. She overheard their discussion about world domination before their regression and their knowledge of space-time regression, which had brought them to the present. While it all started to make sense to her, since she had always suspected that Karnak and Baros were no ordinary knights and nobles, she was still a bit taken aback. She hadn't expected that the two of them were transcendent beings who had once taken over the world before their regression. As she pondered how she had ended up involved with Karnak and Baros, the two of them continued eating their food contentedly, oblivious to her thoughts. Sarathi then told the two that she understood they were trying to raise the Eye of Darkness, but she didn't understand why they were in Deventer territory. Karnak replied that it would have been a hassle if they had been caught using necromancy in their own territory. He added that, considering what the Deventer family had done to his own, this was just a small prank in comparison. Sarathi, hearing this, was unsure how to respond. Karnak then shifted the topic and told the two that it was time to get started. He pulled out the Eye of Darkness, and Sarathi, seeing it, asked him what he planned to do with it. Karnak then told Sarathi that he planned to send the Eye of Darkness through time and space to determine if there was a way to close the door of darkness. With that, he sent it upwards into the sky. As they watched the Eye of Darkness, Sarathi commented that it was quiet, having expected a loud noise. Karnak explained that it was because they hadn't opened the time-space, the eye was only looking inside it. Karnak then informed the two that he would use the Eye of Darkness to enter the Infinity Realm while he was unconscious, asking them to protect him during this time. Both Baros and Sarathi agreed to his request. Karnak closed his eyes and, pleased to see that the Eye of Darkness was functioning, felt confident in his ability to see clearly. As he observed his surroundings, he noticed a dark red tree in the distance. Approaching it, he was both surprised and pleased to find that he had discovered the Tree of Emptiness, also known as Astra Schnaf. The Astra Schnaf was the true form of the authority that Karnak once wielded. As he observed the tree, he knew he should keep his thoughts to himself, but he couldn't help thinking that the Astra Schnaf was rather unattractive. At that moment, a red fruit-like object fell from the tree and landed in the water. Karnak realized that this was how the darkness was spreading and thought to himself that if he could fix this, everything would return to normal. Karnak then wondered where the core of the authority was. As he looked behind the tree, he found the core in the form of a purple mana core. He thought that he might be able to gain some information from it. However, just as he was about to approach, the core shouted at him to stay back. Surprised, Karnak realized that the core was able to speak. The core then spoke, saying that this place was forbidden for those destined to disappear. Karnak, curious, asked the core who it was, and the core responded that it was death and darkness itself. The core then activated its power, and Karnak was taken aback as he witnessed the overwhelming force of the darkness of the end. He wondered how the core was able to control his own power with such ease. The core declared that in the name of Tezranik, Karnak was to return to where he came from. In that instant, Karnak was sent back. As he began to wake up, Baros and Sarathi, who had been anxiously watching over him, were relieved. Baros asked if Karnak was all right, but Karnak, still disoriented, asked what had happened to him. Baros then explained that Karnak's body had started floating, and he had passed out, leaving Baros concerned that something had happened to him. Karnak, however, reassured Baros that they would talk about it later. He then asked Baros the name of the god that the cultists followed. Baros replied that it was the god of death. Sarathi, hearing this, asked if Karnak was referring to Tezranik, the god of death and darkness worshipped by the order of the Black God. Karnak confirmed that this was exactly who he meant. Looking visibly panicked, Karnak told Baros and Sarathi that the god of death was present within the time-space. Baros, stunned, expressed disbelief that the god of death was real, as he had only heard of Karnak being referred to as such in their previous life. Still in shock, Karnak couldn't fully comprehend it himself. Baros then asked, perplexed, why something like that even existed. In a different location, 3 mysterious figures of the Order of the Death Cult were gathered. One of them, known as the Pope of Death, informed the others that there was an issue with the sanctuary. The Dark Lord, surprised, asked how this could be possible, as the sanctuary was supposed to be impenetrable. The third member, known as the Priestess of Destruction, remarked that this was indeed strange and decided to go investigate the matter herself. Meanwhile, a woman rang her bell to summon a maid. When the maid entered, the woman asked if she could bring Huddle to Elazar and inform him that Elazar was looking for him. The woman's name was Elazar de Replation, the imperial mage of the Lanarsa Empire, and one of the 3 archmages of destruction. Moments later, Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi were back at their estate, but Karnak was still dissatisfied. He had not yet found a way to stop the opening. He explained that he had attempted to approach the issue many times after failing initially, but he was concerned that continuing to use necromancy might expose them, which would be too dangerous. Karnak then told the others that the only thing he could confirm at that moment was that the Order of the Black Gods followed Tezranik, and the real issue was their approach. He wondered if they were merely exploiting power that had fallen from the tree, or if they were actively disturbing the tree to seize power randomly. He added that if it was the latter, it would become a serious problem. Sarathi, intrigued, asked Karnak what the difference was between the two possibilities he had mentioned. Karnak then explained to Sarathi that disturbing the tree meant they could influence powers beyond time and space, which would allow them to expand the realm. He added that such a difficult task had taken him years to accomplish, and it was the foundation of the first regression spell. Karnak continued, saying that if the order of the Black Gods was indeed disturbing the tree, they would possess absolute power beyond even his own as the Death King. Both Baros and Sarathi were concerned upon hearing this. Karnak further stated that if the order of the Black Gods held such power, they would not need to resort to unnecessary actions, which also explained how they managed to contain Tezranik within the void. Baros then asked where such a person could have come from, and Karnak, equally troubled, admitted that he too wanted to know the answer. Sarathi then suggested that a part of Karnak's power might have gained consciousness and become the Tezranik being. Baros, hearing this, dismissed her idea, saying that it didn't make sense for power to have consciousness, but Karnak replied that what Sarathi said might actually be true. Baros was taken aback by this. He then told Karnak that he couldn't believe a tree would name itself Tezranik and act like a god, asking if this meant Karnak could create gods. Karnak responded that it could be true or false, but there was a possibility it was indeed the case. Sarathi then pointed out that despite all their speculation, they still didn't know the truth, and the two men agreed. The three of them were left feeling disappointed and stressed by the uncertainty of the situation. Karnak then told the two that he would need to investigate the order of the Black God further and that lower-ranking members wouldn't provide useful information. To get more valuable details, he would have to focus on the higher officials. Baros pointed out that finding these higher members with their current methods would be difficult. After thinking carefully, Karnak suggested that they would need to infiltrate the King's Order to gather more information. The King's Order was a special imperial organization established to hunt members of the Order of the Black God. After the chaos, and under the orders of the seven goddesses, inquisitors and darkness hunters had eliminated necromancers. However, the growing presence of the Order of the Black God across the continent became a significant problem, especially since many of its members were high-ranking nobles or even royalty. It was difficult for the Seven Goddesses Order to handle everything on their own, which is why the Seven Nations came together to form a special division known as the King's Order. Members of the King's Order were granted censor authority, allowing them to investigate and arrest suspected cultists, with rare cases permitting them to execute individuals. Because of this, the selection criteria were strict, and one could only join through referrals. Karnak then told the two that this was the problem, as he wasn't sure how they were supposed to make connections with an imperial organization. Baros responded by saying that he had once been a darkness hunter for a significant period and suggested that perhaps he should have worked closer to the capital to gain more connections. Sarathi then asked the two if joining the King's Order was their plan and mentioned that if they were interested, she could get them an opportunity to apply right away. Karnak and Baros were shocked when they heard this. Baros, with a bright smile, told Sarathi that he hadn't known she had such connections, while Karnak, equally excited, agreed that it was perfect and suggested they pack their bags and leave as soon as possible. The next day, the head butler cried out in pain as he read the letter from Karnak, which stated that Karnak needed to leave for a while but assured them not to worry, as he would return with fame and honor for the family. The head butler, upon hearing this, was upset, as Karnak had run off again without informing him. Moments later, Karnak, Baros, and Sarathi were sitting outside a shop in Darat City, enjoying coffee. Baros then asked Karnak if it was really okay for them to leave like this without properly informing the head butler, Tapal. Karnak replied that Tapal would have stopped them if they had told him directly. He also added that as a lord, he wasn't supposed to leave the estate for long periods, so he had no choice but to do it this way. At that moment, an unknown person approached the three and apologized for being late. Karnak and Baros, however, were excited to see the person, thinking to themselves that their referral had finally arrived. Karnak then greeted the man, asking if he had been well and thanking him for coming, despite the last-minute contact. The man, who was none other than Alias, responded that he was happy to hear from Karnak. That's all for today, thanks for watching.